Ongoing Kenneth Smith Philosophy Seminar. We're in the sequence of sessions that are going through his column in the Comics Journal from around the years 1998, 99, 2000. It was called End Times. It's being collected into a book called Millennia and Microcosm. It is a book that attempts to use the different worldviews of the epoch, the medieval epoch and the ancient epoch, to help us characterize the worldview of the modernist epoch, to help us escape the trap of thinking that we are unique among all people in history because we actually see the world the way that it is, which is the dogma of modernism, and helps us to say, well, if that's not truth, then what is it that distinguishes the way that moderns see the world? Once we know what that is, we sort of gain the ability to escape that labyrinth and start to look at the world through different lens systems. So the goal is, at the end of this book, that we could look at the world either as moderns or as medievals or as ancients, and armed with that ability to modulate between them, we could then ostensibly add as many other lens systems as we want and stop being prisoners of our own mind. So it's a bold claim and a bold program, but we're working our way through it. We're currently in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is his attempt to, in one chapter, summarize the worldview of the ancients by confronting the specific differences, the most dramatic differences between how they see the world and how we see the world, to help us pick up that lens system. It's broken up into lettered sections. We're at the end of section B, Custom and Nature, Aristocracy and Philosophy. We're in the final paragraph of that. And today, I believe we'll make it into section C, which I've been saying for 3 weeks, but I think this week we're really going to do it. But before we do, this final paragraph, he knits together everything he said in section B and in section A, and thus it's a lot juicier than it might seem at first. And part of what I'm going to do today is break it down, in some cases word by word or phrase by phrase, to show how a modernist reading would lead us to think that he's just making a lot of value judgments and waving his arm, but actually he's diagnosing human nature and the nature of these different epochs in order to make some statements about our relationship to the truth and so forth. It's quite pregnant with meaning. But first, Donald has his hand up. I think he has a question from last week. So why don't you go ahead, Donald? Come off mute and lay it on us. You're muted. You have to come off mute again.
Yeah, you did a lot of parallelisms last week. Like Begriff, Verstand, Vernunft, sort of parallel to doulos, Benosos, Aristos. And then you had naive gnosis, naive noesis. And then there was that one that corresponded to Vernunft or Aristos, and I never quite heard what you said for if it was just sort of the non-naive synthesis of gnosis and noesis.
Yes.
Did you have a single term, or did you always use a phrase?
It takes a phrase to say it.
Okay.
It's the mature, it's the third faculty, the mature faculty, in which you harness gnosis and noesis to each other, not in their naive forms, but in the form of a dynamic system, like Heraclitus talks about, when he gives the example of the bending back of a force upon itself, so that the string and the wood of the bow are fighting each other in such a way that creates a dynamic system with energy. And he uses the lyre as another example to string the wood so that you can produce not only melodies but harmonies. So his summation of this, the phrase that Heraclitus uses, is the hidden harmony, and he uses that primarily to describe the way that nature is organized into these dynamic systems that generate all the order around us. But he also uses it as a metaphor for the third faculty of the mind. Once we harness together our gnosis and noesis together into that same kind of dynamic system, then neither of them can rule us again, because if one of them gets too far out of line, the other one pulls it back by fighting against it. That's how the dynamic system helps
Like
us.
the lyre or the bow.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's
Well,
the metaphor for Vernunft and how it relates to notices.
It clears up my notes. I'm going to have them published after you die, like the secret notes from the Heidegger lectures or something.
Oh, God. All my errors immortalized for all time. Oh, God help us all. Thank you, Donald. Phil, go ahead. Come off mute.
Yeah, I was thinking of something very similar to this. So I thought I'd jump in. And my thought is about dialectical thinking. And it really refers me back to the relationship between Parmenides and Heraclitus. And my thought is that Parmenides was not wrong when he says being is. And, today you say it is what it is. Well, that's true, but what is it? I mean, that is not I don't think that was a declarative statement in my thought now. I think it was a riddle. It is what it is. Now let's find out what the hell it is, right? Because it just refers back to itself, and that becomes the way that the mind in a sex is able to represent the world in a dialectical way by questioning, well, what the hell is it? It is what it is, but what is it? We need to know what it is, because if there's one thing that's fundamental to human beings, we talk about arete. The deep part is the human beings are thinking beings, and thinking allow us to, in a sense, interact in the world. But thinking involves questions, not just a matter of uncovering the truth, but also the question that arrives at it. And my thought is that, so that we could come to an understanding. And my thought is like, okay, understanding understands, but what makes understanding understand? And understanding understands by means of reason. The reason, the rules that reason gives for understanding to understand the thing that it wants to understand. Okay, so then it goes back to like, oh, what governs reason? Well, in a funny way, reason is sort of like, how should I say, the foundation of reason is that I think, and my thought about that, it's will, right? And will, well, you could say, what grounds will then, right? This could go on forever. And you would say, well, will grounds itself, because will is actually trapped in the dialectic itself. And my thought is that will either is going to ground itself in a kind of, how should I say, a systematic thinking, which is the will to power. Once we get the system going, we have power.
Yeah.
The other dialectic, the will remains open, which leads to freedom to continue to open, which is actually the free will, will to freedom, which is free will. Free will continues to keep opening the dialectic, which leads to Heraclitus, right? And that, in a sense, you come to it and you get a partial answer, which leads to another riddle. What the hell is that? Which then leads to another one. And so that openness allows us to emerge into a development rather than shutting it down. I think the key issue there is that that's how you mirror nature, because nature does the same thing, except it doesn't do it by will, but trial and error, if you want to call it that way. And I think if you just took Parmenides by itself, it doesn't work. When somebody said, well, it is what it is, man. Like,
Right.
okay, I guess you could just say, I guess I have to suck it up. It is what it is. What the hell is it? I don't know. I mean, so the dialectic is actually a mechanism within the mind to, in a sense, absorb and reinstantiate its relationship with the exteriority.
Mhm.
And I think that relationship is kind of important. I think in a sense, Parmenides put out the riddle. Heraclitus tries to open up the dialogue. And I think that puts it in a very clearly now, whether in a contemporary society, there is a will to power and there's a will to freedom. And those are very, very important contrasts that keeps the thing going. I do not mean that, the will to freedom is all there is, because there's always, because freedom also could consolidate into the will to power, which means you have to open it up again. And I think if we don't understand that, and I'm just so glad that I thought about this, and I finally understand like what the foundation of Greek thinking was, and all the people that came after them was in a sense emerge in solving the puzzle that Parmenides, the riddle Parmenides put out, and then Heraclitus took up the issue, and then Plato, Aristotle, and on just open up that thing that's developing until metaphysics in the later on modernity, in a sense, turn back to the will to power.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. Yeah, the Nietzsche's discussion of the will to power is often lost on moderns because we assume he's just talking about, politicians and rich people and, bullies. We don't understand that he's talking about noesis itself and the functioning of, noesis in its naive form, Verstand. That as Kierkegaard says, as you abstract away from your immersion in experience, that is begriff, and part of what you're doing is with nature, outside and inside nature, no longer being your direct masters. It opens up this question of, well, now how are you deciding what to do? And so will, liberated from the matrix of its own nature and the nature around it, starts to become the authority within you. And that willfulness goes hand in hand, as Kierkegaard talks about, with a certain, what he calls an aesthetic sense. Like an artist, you're sort of deciding, well, how do I want to be? Do I want to do what I was taught to do in school, what my parents taught me to do, what I learned to do, or do I want to choose something different? Maybe I want to be this kind of person or that kind of person. Do I want to be a soldier who's loyal? Do I want to be a lawyer who follows the law? You start to craft yourself. And so there are elements of willfulness and freedom and ego all bound up together in this matrix that is not hard to describe unless you're inside the matrix. It's because then it's the water that you're swimming in and you don't understand it because it's how you see the world. But from outside the matrix of the willfulness of the ego, the freedom, the self-authoring, it starts to take on a very particular character. And as you say, it's bound up with the notion of power, right? The ability to predict when you're going to be hungry as an infant, when that starts to develop, that noetic capacity, it gives you the ability to start to have control over your life instead of just to suffer as a pathos the cycles of appetite and satiety. You can start to anticipate and make plans and call out to your parents and say, hey, I want some milk now. I know because I'm going to be hungry later. It's not that I'm hungry now, but now I'm starting to anticipate how much I don't like feeling hungry later. And so there is this imposition of power upon the cycles of nature, right? This the willfulness goes hand in hand with power. So everything that Nietzsche has to say about power, and it's his withering critiques of it, which, you know, of which the most slap you upside the head critique is power makes stupid. It's like, you don't get much more blunt than a 3-word, you know, oh, to be powerful is not the best of all things, but it is also the worst of all things, because you're going to be a dummy now. You know, we think he's just being sarcastic or snide. Although last week we diagnosed why, in fact, it has to be that way. That is an inevitable consequence of power. But it really gets its bite when we remember that Nietzsche is a Hellenophile, and he is using the Greek conception of character and the way that the mind works and human character works. So when he's critiquing power, he's not just critiquing the rich and powerful, he's critiquing every single person who works and struggles as an infant to free themselves from the matrix of experience. He's saying that part of us that allows us to freely develop their will and make choices to get some power over their lives is simultaneously intelligent and stupid. And the intelligence and stupidity of noesis are interlocked like two sides of a coin or the two edges of a blade. He's giving us a deep critique of the structure of the human species and the way it sees the world, which most translators just pass over because we don't really want to think about that too much. We much prefer to demonize a few bad guys than to do the Greek thing and say, I wonder if there's an issue with all of us that we're going to have to wrestle with. That's problematic for us. So that's actually a good setup for this week's opening paragraph. It's going to take us a while today I think a couple hours to get through this paragraph, might be less, and then we'll be able to start into section C. I shared it before. I don't always remember whether the people who join late can see the earlier chat entries or not. So I'm just going to put it in there again to make sure we're all looking at the same paragraph. And it's only a few sentences here, although they're Kenneth Smith sentences, so they do go on a little bit. But I'm going to use this because this is the final paragraph of B. It pulls together everything he said so far in this book and sets us up for C. As we found when we started into section B, everything in B depended on A. A was the notion of nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. That's the name of the section. And as we saw when we went through it, that is the core theme that he works throughout it, and how different that is from the modern conception of nature as meaningless machine full of resources for us to harvest and use to our heart's content. We see nature as a meaningless pantry / toolbox. And it is there as mere matter waiting for us to impose our genius forms upon with our godlike minds that allow us to foresee the future and develop science and objectivity and all the things that moderns think about themselves. And the Greeks see it as exactly the opposite. They see nature as the realm of the highest forms of truth, the most authoritative forms of truth. You don't argue with gravity. Gravity simply has its way with you. The only way you can fly is to harness other natural forces and use them against gravity, because otherwise there's just no shot, right? We can debate with each other till we're blue in the face, but you don't get to debate with nature. Kata phusei, according to nature, is the highest standard of truth to the ancient Greeks, because they see truth as intrinsic, immanental in the very structure of the cosmos. And as a result, they have no problem explaining where we came from, because nature is just abundantly creative and authoritative. Whereas for us, looking at a meaningless universe that is just waiting for us to impose meaning, it is hard to explain why nature should develop anything, including us. Where then did we come from? If nature has no form and is merely matter, how could it make new forms come into being? And thus we're left with the paradox of the modernist conception of a meaningless cosmos that can't actually explain itself. So we saw that was the basis for the second section, the section that we're in now, custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy, that's talking about Homo sapiens as a cultural animal. We can't run as fast as a cheetah. We can't breathe water and swim really fast. We can't fly and dive like a peregrine falcon, but we are cultural animals. We are born with a frame that has fewer instincts, and we have a driving, aching need to fill in the frame. The aesthetic drive Kierkegaard talks about is our we sometimes talk about stupid pet tricks. What is the thing that makes a species go? What is its stupid pet trick? It's like, trying to outrun a cheetah is a losing proposition, right? That's its stupid pet trick. If you try to fight with it on its own terms, you're going to lose. But if you domesticate it and pet it and feed it, well, then, hooray, we did it. So this way in which people, our stupid pet trick is we're so different. Because one person and another person could grow up in different cultures and fill in the frame differently, and one of them becomes a rocket scientist, and somebody else becomes an artist, and somebody else becomes a brain surgeon, and you can't generalize very easily about saying all people are X, because what all people are is highly mimetic and liable to become something very different from somebody else depending on their circumstances and how they grew up. That's our stupid pet trick. You're not going to find cheetahs building the Eiffel Tower or flying to the moon. You're also not going to find cheetahs deciding to exterminate all their prey to prove their dominance, or being monotheists who think that they have the one true religion that they're going to impose on everybody. Or there's like a whole variety of things that people can do that are liabilities to ourselves that cheetahs can't do. It's not in their nature to be wildly cultural the way that we are, but we're wildly cultural, so we could become almost anything. You don't know what people are going to do. The way that you know what another species is going to do. So all of that is, section B sets all of that up and sets up the problem of why to the Greeks, the way that people are is another expression of the lawfulness of nature, right? Heraclitus talks about that confused people are ignoring the nature around them, but also the nature within them. He sets up this dualism that nature is just as authoritative in the structure of human character, and just as lawful, and just as structured in terms of dynamic synthesis, these systems that are generating order. He says that is also the architecture inside a human personality or character, just like it is out here in the world. No two trees may look alike, but there is order that tends to generate tree-like forms, and it's constantly creative and fecund. It's making it in new ways and different expressions. They say that's what's going on inside people too. People's characters are generated the same way because it's the same nature. It's a lawfulness. And until you understand that lawfulness inside of people, you can't figure out how should politics work, how should economics work anyway. All the things about human beings that we can make decisions about, like Phil was talking about, using the willfulness that's within us as a faculty, how is it to be steered? Well, you have to know that this is what we're working with, that this is the architecture. And so from that, in section B, he derives this notion that just like the Greeks didn't believe in nature as a realm of equality in which all things are equal, but they believed in it as a realm, as a hierarchy in which some things are more authoritative than other things. Nature came above the gods to the Greeks. The gods were expressions of nature, and people come below both of those things in terms of our ability to impose authority on the world. We have to recognize who has more authority so that we know who has to harmonize with whom, right? We have to harmonize with gravity. Gravity's not going to harmonize with us. It has the authority, and we have to learn it and pay attention to it. And the same thing happens inside human relations with one another. We are not all identical clones of one another. We're all different. And it's for this reason that, in a healthy society, we want to pay attention to who are the better artists. If I'm an aspiring artist, I'm not going to start by asserting that I'm as good as anybody else. I'm going to start by looking around and trying to learn from the people who know more about it than I do. If I want to become a brain surgeon, I'm not going to start out of the gate by saying I must already be the greatest brain surgeon of all time because we're all equal. I'm going to recognize that there are hierarchies of experience and understanding and seek out the people who know more about brain surgery than I do. And granted, in human relations, there's no single hierarchy. And in some sense, all of the flaws of the last several thousand years of human societies come from attempting to impose a single hierarchy. This person is in charge of all other people, or this coalition or this Congress is in charge of all other people. When what we see in human relations is that there are multiple different hierarchies all at the same time. I may be really good at programming in the M programming language, but I'm hopeless at programming in the C programming language. I don't know that one. I'm not, I'm not a Hollywood programmer who can program all things and hack all things. There's no such person. We all are standing at the same time, in differing layers of expertise and incompetence. And, and the same is true as far as our creativity. Some people can carry a tune even if they've never been trained, and other people can't. We all have these differential qualities, and we've got to navigate these multiple hierarchies, but we keep insisting on making governments in which there's only a single hierarchy. And we have a person whose imaginary virtues are that they're competent in all fields, or competent enough to judge who should be in charge of all fields, and attempt to create our nice little rigid hierarchies. This never works out. But what the Greeks did believe is that there are generalized differentials among us in terms of our mental faculties, that we are born with, we are all born immersed in the same mental faculty, which is this begriff, this naive gnosis, in which we are live wires, and what we are experiencing is everything to us. The pain that we feel, the hunger we feel, or when we're satisfied, the pleasure we feel at having a full stomach, right? I mean, all these things to an infant are the sum total of their existence. There is a direct correspondence between who they are as a person and what they're experiencing. They map. And this isn't a coincidence, say the Greeks, and say Hegel, and say Kenneth Smith. This is an enormous amount of what the human mind has evolved to be capable of doing. This is a faculty. It is an intelligence within us. And it takes an enormous amount of energy in us in order to immerse ourselves in the experience of life. Last week, we were talking about Juneteenth and the nature of slavery and freedom. And as part of that, we talked about Nora Bateson's concept of symathesy, that the definition of life is to be in an acute learning relationship with the environment around you, that it is your ability to sense what's going on, and in response to what you sense, to change yourself, to better harmonize yourself with what's going on, right? That's the very core of life, and that it can happen without a single neuron, as slime molds show us. It goes far beyond the nervous system. It has to do with feedback loops and our relationships with the world. This is what this first faculty of the mind is about. It's why we have the griff, because if we can use our eyes and our ears and our senses and everything else in order to be live wires, then we can say, ouch, that burns, I'm going to take my hand off the stove. And thus our survival potential goes significantly higher than if we just sat there leaning on the hot stove and burning ourselves, right? This feedback loop is core to life. It's why it's the first faculty. It's why we're all born that way. It's not an accident. It's not a meaningless machine that just happens to be that way, and it's not a coincidence. This is the most important faculty of the mind, gnosis, in this naive form. But gnosis has its limitations, and one of the limitations is that you're constantly surprised by everything. You're too immersed in what's happening. You're paying complete attention to it. You're like, whoa, who could have seen that coming? Whoa, what about that? Whoa, an infant is always surprised at first. And so over time, and some of the surprises are not good ones. Oh God, I pooped myself. So, over time, they learn to abstract themselves out of the matrix of experience that they've been born into. Hegel calls this negation. You begin to reject the immersion, and you create a space for computation and calculation where you can start to say, haven't I been hungry before? Can't I see it coming? Maybe this time I don't have to wait until I'm so hungry. I can plan and try to communicate. I can symbolize my desires and needs and try to get those, happy faces around me to pay attention and get them to bring me the food before I'm so hungry. This leads to the development of the second faculty that the Greeks saw and that Hegel saw, and this is noesis. And in its naive form, the form that we first grow into, Hegel calls it Verstand. And it's what we might think of as an intellect, logic, reason, mathematics, any systematized thinking that is abstracted from the matrix of experience and begins to represent that elements of that experience that matter to us with symbols. and comes up with rules for how the symbols may lawfully be organized in order to arrive at valid conclusions. And based on that, we start creating models of the world. And so we walk around the world in this amphibious relationship to it, in which half of our brain wants to meld and merge with it, and half of our brain wants to extract itself from it and model it from a distance and predict it and try to control it like a puppet master. And both of these are happening at the same time. We have a schizoid structure in our mind in which these two faculties are mutually repelling. They don't like each other. They don't work well with each other. And people, and this is where we really get into the description of human character that the Greeks foresaw, that we've spent the last few weeks talking about, and that Hegel and Kierkegaard and Kafka and Nietzsche and Arendt and Smith are all talking about when they say the easiest way and the most common way to resolve this struggle between these two incompatible faculties of the mind is that people tend to choose one to be the master and the other to be the servant. And so you get people who want to live each day as though it's their last, that they don't want you to think too much about stuff because they don't think that's authentic. You know, you see all the tests on the internet that say, give me your answer, don't think about it, because they think that that first immediate response is the true one, right? The first reactions contain an element of truth. All of this is based on the idea of immersion as the reliable source of truth. And these people develop into douloi, using the Greek model. That's the term for people who use Begriff as their fundamental faculty, and Verstand is a servant for them. They only calculate to the extent that it satisfies their Begriff. Other people, for whatever various reasons, invert the relationship. The extraction from Begriff pleases them more than having been in the Begriff. And so they make Verstand the master. They want to be intellectuals. They want to be academics. They want to be systematizers and logic. And they only use their emotions as an aid to their intellect. They subordinate their Begriff to their Verstand. And these people become Benausoi. Benausos is better at learning disciplines that involve a lot of memorization and systematization. They become better craftsmen. They can become carpenters. They can become lawyers. They're anything that's systematic. They can become better at than a doulos can, because a doulos is too driven by appetites. And what we talked about before is this idea that both of these things are traps, right? Ultimately, even though each of these lens systems for looking at the world seems to have an explanation or understanding for everything, even though it can make sense of everything, it only makes sense of it in a warped, distorted fashion, like funhouse mirrors, right? Or like a warped lens, or like a Procrustean bed is the other example. Pounding square pegs through round holes. You know, this is what each of these mindsets is doing in order to turn the world either into a world that is just brimming over with immediate experience, or a world that is just a bunch of abstractions and mechanisms to be manipulated. Both of these things have a form of profound untruth to them, so that they can understand everything, but only in a form of misunderstanding it. Parts of it they get, parts of it they don't get. They apply this deep fundamental faculty of the mind, which is foreground background. They can make the part that interests them the foreground that seems to be visible, and the part that doesn't interest them, that doesn't fit their mode, they shove into the background, and it seems to disappear away from their consciousness. It's like when you're looking at a scene in a movie and the actors are doing something in the foreground and you're looking at them and you're not noticing the trees behind them or the grass. It's not that you don't see it, it's that you don't attend to it because your brain has decided that's the background and we don't need to worry about that. It's the foreground that we're going to attend to. And in this way, a doulos and a Benausos can look at the exact same scene and produce two completely different pictures. And those pictures make sense in terms of their own worldview. And they're true in the sense that they're consistent with the way that they understand the world, but they're also false in that they do violence to the truth of the world in order to make the infinitude of the cosmos fit with this highly finitized schema for understanding, whether it's parochialized experience or whether it's generalized, universalized abstraction. So that's the background. It only took 43 minutes. That's the background for today's talk, and we'll be able to dive into the paragraph next. But let's pause with questions. Start with Stephen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just looking at Ryan Chapman. He's a current sort of popular figure on the YouTube. You've come across him, I assume?
Not yet.
No, this is something I point out to people, that when I was a kid, the news services generally put a very high value on their objectivity.
Right.
Now, back then, if I was living 50 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined a news service that would desert that.
Right.
I
None of us
wouldn't
would.
imagine that was going to be the progress.
Right.
And, you know, they've buried objectivity. It's like, for example, you know, if they're discussing the current war, if they talk about Vladimir Putin, the news will always say at the start a pejorative of Vladimir Putin, the evil Vladimir Putin.
Or strong man. They like that one.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing in the old objective news. I said, you know, we even though this guy's the other side, we still have to treat him with objectivity. So we just say, we don't prejudice the reader straight away and say the evil Vladimir Putin. We just say Vladimir Putin has done such and such, and we leave it up to the reader to decide whether that's good or bad. But today it's disease proportions. It's a plague. Untruth in the media has become a plague.
Yes.
People prefer untruth because they would like to think that if they don't have a happy life, if they have problems, it's entirely somebody else's fault.
Yes. This is core to this paragraph that we're doing now. I'm so glad you brought this up, because you can see this turning away in the last 50 years has been dramatic. You know, if you just take a 5-minute quote section of Walter Cronkite, you know, talking about the news in the early 1970s, late 1960s, and you contrast that with any equivalent 5 minutes from today, from any news channel. I mean, you don't have to pick the ones that are notorious for being subjectivist, like Fox News. You can pick any of them, and you pick 5 minutes of it, and you put it side by side with Walter Cronkite, and you just sit there shaking your head, going, "What is this? This is alien. It's not even the same kind of thing. How can we claim that this is a continuity of what that was?" You're right, Stephen. It's dramatic.
Well, yeah, I also look at it's like EV cars. Now, they'll point out to you the whole trouble. You know, people think they can go along and buy their EV car and they can not only have their cake, the fun sports car, but they can feel virtuous at the same time. But unfortunately, it's not true. A very small EV, yes. You know, if you just want to drive up to the shops, that does save on carbon emission. But you look at what people want, these larger and larger EVs.
Yes.
Huge batteries. You know, so you got, 60 kilowatt batteries and now 110 kilowatt batteries. So they've got an equivalent range.
Right.
And their carbon emission in their life cycle is greater than its conventional contemporary, even without adding in the factor of the carbon emission that created the electricity. Right. Even before then, they have a bigger carbon footprint than a conventional gasoline engine.
Right.
But the public doesn't want to know that. It wants to know it can have its flash car and still be virtuous.
Right. Right.
And this is all over the place. This is where these alternative powers and even conventional nuclear. Now, if you want to upset the right wing, I say it about conventional nuclear power as well. All these systems will actually use more fossil fuel and more fossil ore in their life cycle than just simply using the fossil fuel at a more convenient level. The problem is, if solar panels or if wind towers lasted forever and were immortal, no problem, but they have a limited lifespan, and then you've got to bury the stuff. But people don't want to hear that. They want to hear that they can have their power and have their environmental virtue at the same moment.
Yes.
have their cake and eat it.
Yes. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, what these examples you're bringing up show is the way in which both Begriff and Verstand, in their different ways of understanding the world, have a tendency to deal with the surfaces of things, whether they're experiential surfaces or whether they're intellectual, ideological surfaces. Either way, they're sort of a short-term things must be the way that they seem approach to life. And it's because both of them are driven by the feedback loop of pleasure and reward that comes from engaging in the Begriff and Verstand, rather than in any kind of commitment to the deeper truth. The commitment to the deeper truth would require a struggle. We'd have to search beyond the surfaces and look and trace out all the relationships between things. Because I think the example that you gave of both solar and nuclear in terms of, but where does it come from? Where do its material? Somebody has to dig up its materials and search for them. Then you have to transport them to the factory. Then you have to refine them. Then you have to assemble them. Then you have to, it's just like all this work that's burning fossil fuels that goes into creating this stuff. And none of that is obvious in the object that you purchase from the dealership. And so it's sort of like it's a hidden component that the only way that you get to it is if you are committed to the truth enough that you want to dig. And for most people, where's the reward in that? Especially if by digging, what they arrive at is that their beautiful illusion is shattered. Well, they don't want their beautiful illusion to be shattered. And that's what this whole paragraph is about, that we have a powerful desire to feel good about our ideologies and our experiences. And that desire is so strong that we will happily do the wrong thing as long as we get the short-term reward. So we'll dig into that. Thank you for bringing that up, Stephen. Phil, go ahead, and then we'll turn to this text.
Yeah, my thought actually follows what you're saying in a way, because, and I was thinking, well, if this dialectical thinking is, in a sense, a negativity, all right, in other words, a criticism, then why is there a movement called positivism and there's not another movement called negativism?
Yeah.
This is an interesting question.
Yes.
Because the problem with positivism is that it's not that they don't have any kind of feedback loop about a negative, but we essentially got it right. It's only a technical fix, right? System is okay. Yeah, we need to tweak this here and there a little bit, and we're good.
Yeah.
And I think if you think about that, what happens is that it becomes a relationship, I said before, about thinking, and then, understanding understands, and how does understanding understand? By reason giving the rule for understanding. And so what happened is that you have then the feedback loop between reason and understanding. They feedback each other. That's the end of the story. That's what it is. And I think that there's a deeper part, like I say, reason actually is grounded in will. And so in some sense, what happened is that the negativity, the criticism, it's a technical criticism of what is. And so what you do is you criticize it on a systematic level. I say, well, there's something much greater wrong with this thing actually than a technical fix. You have to completely think about the structure of the thinking itself in order to get to this. But in fact, negativism, the motive for negativism is positivism. But it is the good positivism, not the positivism that falls back into itself and is a technical fix. But this is a deeper fix, a positivism that on a deeper level says we have to criticize this in order to get to the real truth, something that's bigger, something that's deeper than just a technical fix. Well, just fix this and then everything's good. And I think that's why you never really had a movement called negativism.
Yes.
Because it's not about let's let's tear this whole thing down and let's just get negative. That's it. And it's like, no, we don't want that. We want the progress. The progress needs a technical criticism of the system as it is in order to open up the possibility for another way of seeing a different system that might emerge.
Yes.
Okay. And so important thing to think is that there is a good positivism and there's a bad positivism.
Yes.
And that is the important thing. It actually both is about being positive,
yes,
but in different ways.
That was a Aristotelian kind of distinction there, Phil. Thank you. So I think we have Donald and then Donna. We have a line. So let's do Donald and then we'll do Donna. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, Phil has given me an opening to make just the kind of ironic joke that I would like to make about positivism.
Curse you, Phil. Here it comes.
One, I think they call themselves positivists because they posit things, not because they're moving in any positive direction, really. They're simply asserting things. In fact, they mostly assert negative things, that certain questions can't be answered. So everything is just getting your language straight. If I remember my A.J. Ayer there, which is a famous but vacuous book that provides no enlightenment, other than that if you're going to study philosophy, skip modernity, just go back in time until you find something you like. But so that's for Phil. But I don't know whether to start on this paragraph or let you start, because there are two words in here.
Yes.
That I think are really, one, I really like inventive, because what modernity wants to invent is its rationalizations. It's part of its avoidance procedure. That's why we're so inventive. We want to stay among the deluded, not the existential, as you said.
Right.
And two, I think I've mentioned this before, maybe, that unless there are exceptional information, that unless is sort of, it's unless nature provides us with people capable of doing this, and then unless those people who are capable actually take on the task. Or, like in the Republic, when the philosopher gets out of the cave and sees the light, he doesn't want to go back in the cave. He certainly doesn't want to go back and be an Aristos ruling the city. He says, oh, hey, now I understand. Bye-bye.
That's what Heraclitus did.
I'll go live a good life now that I know how. And so that brings me to sort of a summary.
Yeah.
I think of nothing is known without someone knowing it. There's no sort of just knowledge falls out of the sky or we turn over rocks and
right.
There it is. If human beings know something, somebody has to know it.
I had to struggle for it.
And had to struggle for it and get it. There's just no easy way.
Right.
And yes, and that I'll posit that there's no easy way, so I can be a positivist.
Thank you, Donald. Yes. What Donald just did is what we're going to probably spend the next hour and a half doing is we're going to pick apart this paragraph, because there is a lot more than meets the eye to it. But first, Donna had her hand up, so go ahead, Donald. Come off, Donna, come off mute and.
Okay, I apologize for waving my hand around, but I couldn't find my little digital hand down there, so I had to be waving it around.
I understood.
There's another. There's some psychologists and a psychiatrist I meet with once a week, and we have been talking about this idea of skepticism versus cynicism.
Yes.
Not in the ethereal sense. What is happening right now in America and this schism and where that transitions. And that's in response to Phil, like 10 minutes ago when he was talking. Yeah, negativism, I have seen it slide into cynicism. There are times when I'm a cynic at this point in time about the political system in this country. However, I try to keep that healthy view of, a healthy skepticism. I don't want to belabor the point. I mean, we're all familiar with that, but that is my answer to Phil. Again, I want to answer something else you were talking about neuroscientists. There also is a particular neuroscientist we're following now. His name is Giulio Tononi, and he is addressing some of the things you were questioning, Rick.
Giulio Tononi?
Giulio Tononi, T-O-N-I-N-O. He is both a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. And he is rejecting the idea that our wetware is what is determining our minds totally. I don't want to talk further because I promised myself and others I wouldn't talk this time. I would keep listening to you, but I just had to bring that up, okay? And the last thing is I want to apologize. I have to leave at 1:30 for another, an important meeting.
Sure.
I'd love to stay, but I will change that again, but I'm just apologizing now. So I'm done.
Okay, thanks, Donna.
Okay.
So I put a link in there to Giulio Tononi so we can follow up and do some reading. I misspelled the name, but the Wikipedia link has it right. So thanks for bringing that up. And yeah, I mean, this is part of what's interesting about this Greek Hegelian model of the mind is they say, okay, so we've got the potential for these three faculties, but what we do with them is cultural or individual. I mean, there's just an enormous variety of ways in which these faculties can be wielded in order to, produce different kinds of people and different kinds of thinking and decision making. So I think this is in sync with what you're saying that Tonani is saying. That if we're attempting a mechanicalist model of human nature in the belief that every part of human behavior is going to have some location in the brain, which I've certainly seen plenty of over the last 50 years as some kind of a holy grail, of the mechanists, we're going to fail. Because we're going to find that, every part of the brain is some kind of switching station that moves things through rather than being the one and only home in which this thing only happens here. It's the connectivity of the brain, obviously, that as we're learning, it's becoming increasingly obvious that the connectivity makes all kinds of things possible. And so, sure, there might be vulnerable spots where you can cut through and now a person can't talk, but that doesn't mean that was the spot where all language comes from. So I think we're with Tonani increasingly on this. And it's a very Greek, it's a very, the Greeks weren't so clear on exactly where consciousness was. I remember the liver played a significant role in some of their ideas about where emotion comes from, things like that. But, they knew as much as they could, they sort of got this idea of the network effect, that a lot of things are the result of dynamisms rather than objects. But let's I spent some time preparing for you guys a dissection of this paragraph, and partially it's because this is the final paragraph of the section so far, and so it gives us a summation. Partly it's because we talk over and over about how Kenneth Smith took time off to reinvent his own use of language back in the late 80s and early 1990s, because he was disgusted with the extent to which he was trying to philosophize using terminology that had been invented by a specific culture in a specific epoch with a specific worldview that excluded all kinds of possibilities without admitting that that's what it was doing. And he found himself fighting his own use of language. And so he reinvented it. And, I make this claim and I say it, and some people take it on authority and other people shake their head and go, sure, whatever, Rick. But I think this paragraph is an ideal opportunity to show in a measurable way what I'm talking about. So let's take this apart. The first term to take apart, if we start with this first sentence, is the word aristocrats. And we did most of what we needed to do on it last week, but let's just summarize again. A modern reading of the word aristocrats is whoever happens to be in charge and or whoever claims that they deserve to be in charge We think that's what an aristocrat is. It's somebody who thinks that other people shouldn't get to govern and only they should. Or if you're already in an aristocracy, then it's the people who are in charge who spend a lot of time patting themselves on the back and claiming that they're better than everybody else. That's a modern reading of the word aristocrat. But if we read Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle is crystal clear that for each form of government, there are two different forms. And aristocrat comes from aristocracy, which is the good form that he sets in opposition to oligarchy. He says any small group of people who want to be in charge are an oligarchy. And if their only reason for being in charge is that they happen to be in charge, this is among the worst forms of all government. It says oligarchies are a terrible form of government. They're rotten. And they may call themselves aristocrats, but they're not. You can't buy into their propaganda, or else it becomes impossible to make distinctions between that really matter. The word distinguished is in fact the third word of this paragraph. Making careful distinctions, Aristotle and the Greeks see as the very heart of understanding things. And if we allow our language to be propagandized and spun in order to rationalize the powers that be, then we're going to misunderstand everything that we see around us because we're trying to think with warped tools, if you will. So Aristotle wants us to make a clean distinction between an aristocracy and an oligarchy, and that means he wants us to distinguish between an aristocrat and an oligarch. And someone who just happens to be in charge because they're a member of an oligarchy is not to be confused with an aristocrat. They're like opposites in the Aristotelian sense. An oligarch is someone who is in charge, but an aristocrat is someone who should be in charge. And the reason that they should be in charge is not that they happen to be or because they have money or power, but because they're an aristos. And so there's a whole theory of human character that Aristotle is deriving here. And it comes out of the discussions that we've had. We've talked about the way that a doulos is a prisoner of their experiential life. What they want is so important to them that they will sacrifice truth and justice and anything else in order to get what they want. And they may not think that about themselves because it's not flattering to think that. But if push comes to shove, they're driven by their parochial experience and their drives. And so you can't trust them, because sooner or later, governance will put them into a place where they have to make a choice, where they have to hurt themselves to do the right thing, and they won't do it because they're a doulos. That's what it means to be a doulos. To be a doulos, to be bound in begriff is to be ruled by your experience, whether it's the outside experience of sensation or the internal experience of your feelings and memories and so forth. And so, you are going to get screwed over by a doulos who is made an oligarch. It's just going to happen, even if they don't want it to. It is in their character. This is, again, goes back to this Greek conception of character as a kind of lawfulness. It can generate an enormous amount of complexity and variation, but it's going to do so according to its own internal natural laws. So the same, says Aristotle, would be true of a banausos. A banausos is going to be trying to calculate the truth and trying to calculate ethics based on their models and their methodologies. And the problem with that is calculation can't actually lead you to the truth. It can only lead you to validity. When you study logic, initially they're very clear about the fact that validity and truth are two different things. Validity means, given these a priori assumptions, these propositions, and given these rules of logic that we're following, these are the conclusions that are valid. But what logic can't tell you is whether those propositions make any damn sense at all. I mean, your initial proposition might have been that, Jews are bad people and people who aren't Jewish are good people. And if you start with that as your proposition, it doesn't matter how good your logic is. You're going to get bad conclusions. The same is true for the rules of logic. If your rules of logic are bad, even if your initial propositions are good, you're going to get bad conclusions. And as recent modal critics of logic have proven, one of the flaws of most logic is that it's too damn binary, right? Things are either true or false. Well, not in the real world. In the real world, things are often very complicated. They may be true in their own terms, but in human terms, the actual natural terms in which they boil down to true or false are not representable. And so there's a warpage that happens when you translate reality into our own ability to conceive of things in a finite mortal way. And by the time that translation has been done, trying to say this is either true or false just isn't going to work anymore. What it is athwart our categories. in a way that's sort of inexpressible. We use the example of Flatland, the short little novel, and the attempt of the Flatland people to describe what happens as a sphere passes through their plane. And, you know, what they describe is neither true nor false because it's missing parts of the larger cosmos. It's unable to represent the truth of the, it can't even conceive of the third dimension. So what actually happened is inexpressible. And this is the flaw, in a simplified form, this is the flaw that afflicts all noesis. So all Banausoi are going to be translating issues of right and wrong and truth and falsehood through their own ideologies. And the ideologies are warped both by their a priori assumptions and by the structure of their logics. And as a result, you end up with a mess. Furthermore, there is a complication to Banausoi, to naive forms of noesis, and that is, as Hegel points out, there's an enormous amount of rejection of complexity. There's an enormous amount of, you know, the rejection of experience. The one thing, experience, the experiential life may be parochial, but one thing it has going for it is that it can't stop paying attention to what it experiences. There is no way to pretend that things aren't happening. If you feel them or you remember them, then they're real to you. Whereas when you get into the realm of noesis and you've distanced yourself from that, things can actually be happening that a doulos would notice and attend to, but that a Banausos can ignore. And they can say, well, that's not part of my theories. I'm going to treat that. In medicine, they call it an anomaly. Why does somebody who's obviously going to die in 3 weeks instead, 4 months later, there's no sign of cancer? Where did it go? Well, we put it on a shelf and say, it doesn't fit my theories. So that's an anomaly, and I will now ignore it for the rest of my career and go back to looking at my theories and only pay attention and diagnose and treat people on the basis of the rules, how it's supposed to happen, not what actually happened. This choice to shove away the real world in order to make things fit within the categories is the affliction of a Banausos. And if you put a person like that in charge, you know they're going to trample the truth, and you know they're going to trample justice, because they're going to follow whatever their ideology is. They have to. That is their character as a Banausos. Their whole, and furthermore, it's not a coincidence that they're a Banausos because everybody starts out in Begriff. They struggled their whole life long to make themselves be that way. And they're certainly not going to cast that aside just because there's some inconvenient truths lying around. They're going to stomp those truths into the ground and focus on the thing that satisfies their theory. You put people like that in charge of governing, and you just know they're going to be trampling the things that matter. It's going to happen. And, if their theories line up pretty well with reality, they're only going to be trampling and clobbering people from time to time. But, it would be better if they didn't ever clobber and trample people, but that would require them to be balancing and harnessing both gnosis and noesis. Each of these choices contains a fatal flaw. It's suppressing part of reality in order to focus on the part that it focuses on. And nobody can safely govern who suppresses part of reality. Governing has to be more of an art than a science, in which you're willing to cast aside both your own parochial experiences and your own favorite theories whenever reality doesn't fit those models. You have to be willing to say, I thought that this would work, but all these people are telling me they're not happy, so evidently it's not working, which means I got to go back to the drawing board. Douloi can't do that. Banausoi can't do that. They will not do those things. Only somebody who has liberated themselves from the two traps that we're born into is capable, not that they will, but is capable of casting aside their favorite theories and their favorite feelings in order to try to do justice. And Aristos, in the model that when we say aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, when he says that, he's not saying that they're always going to do the right thing. That would be propaganda, right? That's what an oligarch would say about themselves. I always do the right thing. It's bullshit, right? We're people, we're mortal, we're flawed, we're going to screw up. What makes an Aristos distinguishable is that an Aristos is committed to trying and is willing to make a fool of themselves and admit their errors, because their commitment to right and wrong, their commitment to the truth is greater than their commitment to either their ideologies, their social status, the rewards that they get from culture, how they feel about themselves, all those things they're committed to setting aside in favor of trying to do the right thing. And what Aristotle and the Greeks say is, by nature, kata phusei, according to the highest authority there can be, which is the natural lawfulness of things, most people cannot and will not do that. Ergo, they should not govern. And what he's trying to say as well is that governance should be disentangled from all these rewards that lure Douloi and Benausoi to crave above all things to be in charge. They crave above all things to be in charge in order to reward themselves and their families, to make feel good about themselves, in order to satisfy their theories, in order to impose their architectural vision of society upon society, which, for example, was either the Nazi or the Stalinist plan. I have a scheme, this is how it's going to work, and everything that doesn't fit the scheme is going to be exterminated or pushed off to a gulag, and I will force society to fit my intellectual schema. This is Noetic behavior, right? This is Banausic behavior in a nutshell. I would call it a caricature, except this is what they do over and over. They can't stop themselves from trying to impose their theories. You can't let those people govern. And part of our problem is, in modernity, we deny there's any such thing as human nature, human character. We're all equal, we're all the same, and we're all the same in all being different. We're 1,000 snowflakes and butterflies who are all different from each other, except that we're all the same. This is kind of the modernist take on human nature, which is, there's nothing to see here, don't worry about it, let's just ignore it. And that's how you could have a US Constitution in which the only requirements are that you be a citizen of a certain age. Like literally you could eat people, and that's fine. You could have spent your whole life ripping people off, and that's fine. You just, as long as you're a citizen and you're a certain age, you can rule. This is there couldn't be a more classic example of the difference between the Greek conception, the ancient conception, in which nature matters and is lawful and you should harmonize with it, which means you should pay attention to human nature, and only people whose nature would allow them to govern should be allowed to govern, versus the modernist conception in which there is no human nature. Nature is not binding on anybody, anything goes, and we'll just use enough rules and laws and somehow magically utopia will surely follow. This is like, let's all have a committee meeting, and as we all know, nothing bad could ever come out of a committee meeting. Only good results will follow from our debates and discussions. So I'm spending the time on this. Because this term aristocrats for us is so loaded with propaganda and self-flattery and rationalization that we can't read it the way the Greeks meant it. We can't read it the way that Kenneth reads it unless we've gone through the material that came before, and we bring it to bear here. We resist the impulse to inject into that word aristocrats the popular modern meaning, and we instead insist upon an Aristotelian, Hegelian, Smithian reading, which is not that they are an oligarch, not that they are in fact in charge, not even that they want to be in charge, but those whose inner lawfulness, whose character, the way that they're built internally makes them possibly fit to govern. At least we know they're not obviously unfit from the get-go, like 2 out of 3 character types are. That's what he's saying. When he says aristocrats, he means Aristoi as opposed to Douloi or Benausoi. Of course he means that. And when you read the rest of the sentence, it's obvious that he means that, but only if you know that's the background. And this is why it's so easy to read Kenneth Smith and not have any idea what he's talking about, because it sounds like he's just patting people who have power on the head and saying, aren't they great? Isn't it great to be an oligarch? It's so wonderful. And the reason that we think that is we've heard that so many times through our history, because oligarchs love to pat themselves on the head. We all know what that propaganda looks like. This sentence looks like a propaganda sentence, unless you know what Aristoi are and what this whole framework is. I'm going to call on Phil at 12:25 because we got the 30-minute cooldown rule, which is imposed. So hold that thought, Phil. Don't forget. I'll come back to you. So that's aristocrats. All right. Distinguished is mostly straightforward, except there is a Heraclitus line about how, you have to be, and certainly an Aristotelian line about making the proper distinctions, learning to cultivate your language to give you the ability to distinguish things that should be distinguished and compare things that should be compared is part of the key to being able to reason about the world. And if you don't put in the time and discipline to work on your use of terminology, everything that follows is hopeless. So he's saying part of what makes Aristoi go is that they have worked on their language and their thinking in order to draw distinctions that matter. And we need to draw those distinctions as well, or else we're not going to be able to say who's fit to govern and who's not fit to govern. I always come back to the Martin Luther King quote, which is that he dreams of a world in which my young children will not be judged by the color of their skin. And most people stop there and say, see, he's against racism. It's like, yeah, sure, but keep reading. He says, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He wants them to be judged by the content of their character, right? Martin Luther King Jr. is not opposed to judgment. He's in favor of judgment, but he wants us to judge distinguishing on the things that matter. If we don't distinguish on the basis of things that matter, we make ourselves incompetent to understand the world. And so we have this same thing here. What Kenneth Smith is trying to say is we have to distinguish people who are fit to govern from people who aren't fit to govern, or else we'll end up with an incompetent government. And for us to do that, we ourselves also have to develop in ourselves the ability to make the distinctions that he's now going to say that Aristoi, i.e. aristocrats, have. That they too are going to make distinctions. That means this sentence is only really comprehensible to people who can understand the concept of an Aristos and who are willing to do enough work to get that far in their understanding. Cast this sentence before Douloi and Benousoi, and they will understand it in a way that hammers it into the framework of their worldview, but warps it out of all recognition in the process of doing that. There is a meta level to this sentence that is inescapable. Aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos. An ethos. Oh, the word ethos. Oh, the word ethos. You can't see the word ethos anywhere in Kenneth Smith. Oops, sorry. I did that to David. I should have posted that to everybody. Let's try that again. Ethos. Right? Ethos anthropoi daimon, says the fragment from Heraclitus. Character is fate, the guardian divinity of each person, which nudges them to harmonize with itself, right? That a person's character is like is a representation of their inner nature. And in the Greek conception, nature is the thing that has authority that we have to harmonize to in order to have a successful life, or as successful as we can, that we need to, align ourselves with the hidden harmony. And ethos anthropoi daimon, human character, is a kind of lawfulness that we also need to learn about and harmonize with and make sense with. When he says that aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos, he's saying that they are fated to do the things that they do. Just like an object dropped off a cliff is fated to do what's about to happen next, because the lawful character of nature is imposing certain directions upon things. Gravity is going to pull that rock down. And the ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth is going to pull an Aristos in certain directions. Like any other archai in the world, like any other principles, the actual expression of that ethos is going to vary depending on circumstances. Symathesy, right? Is there a wind blowing? Is it raining? Is it, all these other things are going to affect the fall of the rock. And the same is true for the way an Aristos is going to express the commitment to intrinsic truth. It's never going to be the same twice. There is an infinitude to principles. They express themselves in an infinite variety of ways because there's an infinite number of conditions in the cosmos, and they are all involved in symathesy. So they're subtly changing their expression and their course to take other things into account, which means we're not saying that you're going to get a simple, predictable result out of an Aristos. But one way or another, an Aristos is going to, in their own individual way, express this need that they have to commit to intrinsic truth. And that is not the need that a doulos or a benausos has. A doulos needs to immerse themselves in their own experience in a way that makes sense to them. And the benausos needs to immerse themselves in their ideologies and their education and the intellectual rationalized systems that they climb in order to progress in society. That's what they need to do. But an Aristos has done the struggle such that at least some of the time, they don't need to do either of those two things. But what they do need to do is they need to express an allegiance to, a commitment to intrinsic truth. Next up, commitment. This is an important term to distinguish from modern conceptions of like loyalty. This is for this to make sense, we have to go back to what Phil said before about arbitrary will. There is a relationship between will and freedom that is being critiqued by Nietzsche when he says power makes stupid. That's intrinsic to all of us. We alluded to that before, but this conception of commitment, you know, part of what makes will what it is that it chooses a direction for itself. It chooses to take action. It has a certain loyalty to its choices, and it may put them down afterwards, but at least in the moment of action, it has a commitment. When people join a rigid social structure, such as the military, they have to take an oath of loyalty to the system that they've joined, and they have to agree to subordinate their will, which previously they believed to be free, to the will of the organization. And they consider that loyalty to be one of the highest virtues. They consider it almost equated with honor itself. And you know, it is fierce in military organizations. It is a fierce commitment, but it is a commitment that is a form of, and you know, this will be anathema and horrifying to people who served in the military if they still feel this way, but it's inescapable from this critique. It is a form of self-pacification and abandonment of responsibility and duty. It was critiqued in the Nuremberg trials. All those people who did all those terrible things during the Holocaust said, well, I had to because I was following orders. And the judgment of Nuremberg is that's not an excuse. You can never lay down your duty to be a moral agent in the world. You can never say, my captain has the duty to be a moral agent. I only have the duty to follow my captain's orders. And any military structure or other social system that tells you you must give up your moral authority and responsibility and instead subordinate yourself and I will decide for you what's moral and you just have to obey, that is all intrinsically immoral. It's not a virtue, it's a vice. It leads to danger. And you know, some of the worst crimes in history have been done under that model. So when he's talking about a commitment, he's not talking about a mindless loyalty. You know, he's not talking about an idée fixe where you just lock yourself into this framework. He's talking about an escape from the passivity of naive gnosis, of being a doulos. He's talking about an escape from the active passivity of naive noesis, of being a banausos, an escape from the abnegation of responsibility that a banausos takes when they subordinate their will to the system that they've joined. He's talking about instead a relentless, endless, self-aware choice that keeps critiquing itself, keeps being self-aware, and keeps choosing to harness oneself into the dynamic harmony of the logos. It is to say there is a greater authority, but it's not to be found in the arbitrary will of individuals or institutions. They're all mortal, they're all finite, they're all flawed. It is to be found in the lawfulness of the truth, kata fuse, according to nature, the deep principles of the cosmos that organize things. And that what we want to do is harmonize ourselves with those to find one's best place. Keep holding your thought, Phil. I have to go for just a couple more minutes to finish this idea. Part of what's key to this is the notion that there are some parts of nature that are more important than others, that not all things are equal. As we'll come back to again, Heraclitus says, nature loves to hide. When he says that the things that we see in the world are generated by more important, deeper things that are principles, that are fountains of order, he's saying that to align ourselves with the cosmos, what we want to harmonize ourselves with is those deeper principles, not the fluctuating phenomena around us that are fountaining out of them, because that's to mistake the flag, right, for the sword in the bullfight. We have to know what is the deeper principle, what is the more important thing that's at stake. And so we want to commit ourselves to the parts of nature that matter. There is a concept here, there's a Greek concept called Kairos. And we've talked about it before, Kairos. And Kairos is the moment that is not like other moments. It's the moment when if you act now, it will make a bigger difference in the world than if you act at some other time. It's the recognition that at many times in life, our efforts to change things are ineffectual. it's like running in sand or fighting the tide of a river. But at certain moments, the movement of history is moving in the right direction, that if you want to take an action in that direction, instead of impeding you, it's going to magnify you. And you have a chance to make a difference, to do the right thing. This commitment that an Aristos makes to finding the better place to act, the better loyalty to have, is similar to this notion of Kairos, where instead of it being time, it's either location or principle or what have you. It's some aspect of nature that you commit yourself to. And by doing that, you increase your chances of doing good in the world. This is core to what it means to be an Aristos. Anybody can mindlessly follow orders. Well, not anybody, but a lot of people can mindlessly follow orders and commit themselves to, I will just do what I'm told. Or they can commit themselves to a fixed idea. But to commit yourself instead to a deep principle of the world means that you're constantly questioning yourself and whether you're doing a good job of it, that you might not understand the thing that you're committing yourself to. You might have to update your understanding and therefore change your behavior and your strategies and what you do. It is a difficult, fluctuating kind of commitment in which it has to be alive to your growing understanding of what's happening. There's a relationship here to the notion of the Archimedean standpoint. When Archimedes says, give me a long enough lever in the right place to stand and I could move the world. He's speaking physically of the mechanical advantage of a lever. But ever since then, philosophers have talked about the Archimedean standpoint as a leverage on yourself or on your society to be able to get outside of it and look back at it so that you can finally have some mental leverage and understand the thing that you couldn't understand as long as you were immersed inside of it. Kenneth Smith frequently refers to the Archimedean standpoint. This commitment that an Aristos makes is this kind of a commitment to finding an Archimedean standpoint that you can use to get leverage on what would otherwise trap you within a dualic or a banausic mode. This is what he's referring to. Why are they committed to intrinsic truth? Because if they're not committed to intrinsic truth, then they will be, by definition, by default, inexorably like falling into a black hole. They will either be a doulos or a banausos. Without this, this is the thing that allows them to not be trapped within them. It is an Archimedean standpoint. There's a Kafka quote. He was permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint, but only on the condition that he use it against himself, which is a description of how modernity subverts the Aristos and makes it impossible to be an Aristos, so that your very drives end up thwarting you. And this goes to this heart of, can you be an Aristos or an aristocrat in a culture that's hostile to the emergence of Aristoi? Or are you instead some sort of failed Aristos who ends up living a dualic or banausic life because it's the only choice available to you? Kenneth Smith often talks about the way that Aristoi under modernism end up homeless, in prison, in mental institutions, taking lots of psychoactive drugs or alcohol, or doing anything they can to dull the pain that comes from not being able to be true to yourself. He says in here, aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of a commitment to intrinsic truth so visceral, right? This is still talking about the commitment here. It is a need to do this. And if the need is thwarted, the human being becomes broken. It's true for douloi. They need to be able to express their doulicness, their douleia. It's true for banausoi. They need to be able to express their banauseia. And it's true for aristoi. They need to be able to express their aristeia. This commitment is not just a modernist, abstract, intellectualized commitment in which we freely choose to do this thing. The Greeks didn't believe in that kind of freedom. They believed in the kind of freedom in which, if you cultivate your character appropriately, you can create small zones of freedom in which you don't have to act according to your autonomic behavior. And it is in that zone of cultivation that the Aristos makes this commitment to intrinsic truth. It is the form of the commitment. And it is made because it allows them to harmonize better with the inexorable force of their own inner character, which gives them this burning need to do it anyway. There's a paradox here between freedom and necessity. ananke, that's bound up in this commitment. They choose it, but they also have to choose it. If they don't choose it, they break themselves. So this is one of those places where the finite attempt to represent an infinite thing, like freedom, kind of founders on the rocks of our finitude. And we lose the ability to talk clearly about if is this a free commitment or is this a necessitated commitment? Because the full picture, once we get out of the flatland of modernist interpretations, is yes, both. It is both things at the same time in a very complicated way. All right, that's commitment. Phil, go ahead. I'm sorry to keep you waiting so long.
Well, that's quite all right. It seems to me, in order to govern, one has to have room in one's mind to understand complexities and contradictions, particularly when you have multiple centers of multiple places of specialization and hierarchy and understanding. And to compile that together in any form at all, even though maybe you're not capable of it in that deep sense, you have to be able to understand that network of relationships within a culture.
Yes.
And much of it is perhaps contradictory and certainly ambiguous. And some of it, nobody even understands. So it has to extend beyond the present into the future, which is a deep problem.
Yeah.
And my thought is, remember a couple of weeks ago, I asked a question, people were saying, oh, everybody loves children. And I said, well, I'm not so sure, right? And I raised a kind of objection, not that I hate children. It's like, I'm not so sure whether society actually loves children.
Yeah.
I'll present that, and I'll present my thoughts afterwards about how that goes. It's been pretty much shown that as society developed in industrial culture, that people move off the farms into the cities in order to work. And in the farms, having plenty of children was a good thing because they were free labor, okay, in some sense.
Yeah.
Free hands to help. When you move into the city and you live in a smallish flat apartment or what it is, and all the parents have to go to work, it's shown that the fertility rates have decreased. And this is worldwide, right?
Right.
So why did it decrease? It's because, well, now you're in the city, it's kind of a pain in the neck. Not that you shouldn't have children. I'm just saying there's a pain in the neck to have to raise them, nurture them, pay for the education, all the things, and then when they grow up, they leave. And so in that sense, and so many people have made, quote, I'll put quotes in this, wise choices, and let's not have so many kids, And so that's been proven to be true, at least factually, okay? Yeah. And so that's my thought. And then I'm thinking about it, and that is really under the umbrella of a particular economic structure.
Yes.
In which is the case, right? So you have to go beyond, well, do you want kids or do you want kids? That's a simple question. And many people decide that, well, we want less kids, but they have to think beyond just that particular question and talk about how this is situated in economic structure.
Yes.
And it just came to mind, recently to me, it just popped in my head now with the recent Supreme Court, about Roe versus Wade and all that. And I'm thinking, well, this actually in a funny way relates to my question about children. It really is not whether you believe in even, abortions or not. And that's a different issue. I actually support it, but nonetheless. But then if we had a social structure in which women were given the kind of support they should have, I think there is a basic difference between men and women, and women would more likely to at least prefer to have some more intimacy with their children. And if you give them structure in terms of maternity leaves, child support, like all these things that allow them to be liberated, and yet and for them to be with the family and with the children, you would probably have more women that might stay home. You have some women that might spend more time at home and part-time at work and so forth, because there's a support structure. So it turns out that, to me, it seems like that issue of abortions is, in a sense, lost in the, we forget about the deeper issue, is that if they were given the support, that we might not be so up to arms about abortions, because maybe there will be less. I don't know. It's just there's a deeper issue about the inequality that women have to, once they go to work. And I remember when my sister was raising her children, she was often crying because, she was a lawyer, her husband was a lawyer. He comes home and he goes upstairs in his bed and he does whatever he does. And she has to take care of all this stuff, like, not only is there not like governmental support, but there's really no family support.
The second
Now,
shift.
and I do not mean to say now all your men have to go out there now and support your wife. I'm just saying that there's a lack of support to truly allow women to be whatever they want to be, because they're, in a sense, in a structure where they're forced to be quasi men to compete in a world of economic structures. And I think if we, so that to me is a deeper issue. Now I have a second thing that I thought of in terms of government. You were saying, like, how is this guy? Does a guy who have this understanding, does he have to be the president or the premier or whatever it is, the king, the head leader? And I'm thinking, maybe there's a relationship between the public and the private, and you might have a very elegant speaker with a lot of charisma taking that role, and maybe the real work is being done by the advisors, because they have a deeper understanding, but they're not like a public person as such. And I'm thinking, and I'm not going to sing the hymns of Deng Xiaoping, because I'm not singing the hymn, but I will say this. When Deng Xiaoping was the leader, in a way, the silent behind the scene leader, Deng Xiaoping was never the chairman of the Communist Party. He was never the premier. The highest office he ever held was a vice premier, and he only held that temporarily. But everybody who went to China knew they're not going to talk to the chairman. They always talk to Deng Xiaoping because he's the one that actually moved things around rather than the chairman of the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. So how is it that you could have a system in which the guy who's like shouldn't have the authority actually does have the authority? And I wonder whether that actually should work, because if we have a very understanding president that knows that he doesn't have the competence, but he's the leader, and it's a public face the leader, then if he had like a, I guess in this case, the cabinet, and these were very, very wise people who gave him advice to help him along, maybe that would work, except that the problem is that we have a system in which when you're the president, you overrule everybody. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether the system should be much more relational in terms of the structure of the inner circle. And I think that might pool the wisdom together in a way, rather than a single guy, particularly an incompetent guy, who, I will do what I want. Forget about the laws, forget about this and that, whatever. So I'm just wondering whether, I believe in democracy, but I wonder whether our democratic structure is the correct structure as the way it's manifest now. So that's my thought about children, about women, and about the presidency or the head leader. So that's what I'm adding to the thing. And that thought came to mind, by the way, is what you said about even in nature likes the high,
Yes.
just as Deng Xiaoping likes the high.
Thank you, Phil. So, there's all kinds of interesting stuff we could talk about that. But I'm just going to stick a pin in it because we'll have more opportunities. It's going to come up over and over. It's, I think, worth noting that the thing you said about the challenge with more children being a blessing on a farm, but being a problem in the city, it goes to the heart of what might be a Greek critique of urban life, which is, in urban life, you don't have much room. You don't have the space you need in order to actually set up an oikos. An oikos is not just a farm. It's all the land included in the farm that has all the things that you need in order to create a mostly self-sufficient existence. Your farm and all the people who live there act as a community dedicated to meeting the metabolic needs of the human animal. And they can only do that if they have access to water and fertile land and trees. And there's a lot of things that need to be there so that they can build houses whenever they need to within their land, so that they can create clothing whenever they need to, they can feed themselves, they can drink. And that's what makes it an oikos. It's the combination of the resources being available in a sustainable way and the people being united to solve these problems for each other. And if you're missing any part of that, you don't have an oikos. If you have people who are busy trying to exploit each other instead of helping each other take care of each other, it's not an oikos. And if you don't have access to water and fertile soil in sufficient quantity and wood in sufficient quantity and so forth, then it's also not an oikos. So the moment you move from the farm into the city, the problem that you face is it's simply impossible to be an oikos anymore. And that means you can't build a community. You're constrained by the walls of your house and the teeny tiny property line that separates you from your neighbors, which is not even close to adequate. And as a result, the form of life that you can have in the city is not, it can't fully express the human animal, right? Children as a blessing is not fully expressible within an urban environment. And to live in an urban environment is therefore, on the one hand, it's natural in that we have done this and we've done it over and over all over the world. There's a drive in us to come together that creates this form of organization. But on the other, it's at the same time impeding us in a certain way. And so you get this tragic inversion in which, we start to want fewer children than we had before. Because it's just the only practical thing to do. I'll call on Stephen, and then I'm going to take us back to the text. Go ahead, Stephen.
I suppose, that's an aspect. If I was to read something like the Icelandic Sagas, going back to the Aristos idea, it becomes so obvious that these sagas are telling us that there's only a small percentage of people within a society who can really display leadership. The rest are looking for somebody to follow. And in marginal circumstances, they'll follow somebody who produces the good results. And some people just have that amazing ability to, some of their heroes end up with nothing, but then make their comeback as chieftains who've just got the goods on how you do things.
Mm-hmm.
All the other guys come along, how do I run a farm? I'll be your follower. Give me a piece of land. Now, how do I run the farm? How do I, seed the fields? What are the best techniques? There just seemed to be this guy who either himself had the goods or had close followers who had the goods.
Yeah.
And they were just, and of course, back in those times, people believed that the aristocrats were family lines who were blessed by the gods. They were just naturally lucky.
Mm-hmm.
So you tended to follow people with aristocratic backgrounds. But okay, so how did you get with the story of Gleipnir?
We're getting there. It's in this.
Okay, right.
We'll
Yeah,
come
we're
to
going
it.
to get there, are we? Okay, thanks.
We are. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought it up. I knew it sounded familiar. I knew I'd heard it before, and it wasn't just from Norse mythology. It was also from Kenneth Smith. He talks about it in one of the books, and it comes up on this. So all right. So I belabored the term commitment here because it's almost impossible for a modern to read that word in this sentence and get even the remotest sense of what Kenneth Smith means by the word commitment. And it's not just that Kenneth is being arbitrarily fussy. It's that commitment has to be part of this whole framework. What is freedom? What is determinism? What is the human nature? What is nature outside of us? How does authority work? What are the needs that drive us? What happens if you try to compel people to do things in opposition to their needs? There's this whole structure of understanding of the world that's tied up in this notion of an ethos of commitment. That it's not that Kenneth is positing these things, it's that if you do justice to the Aristotelian, Heraclitean, and so forth concepts from the classical world, then it must mean these things. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit. And they, in fact, say in their various writings in their various ways that they mean this by it. But unless we've read those things, and unless at the moment of reading this sentence, we recognize the relationship and pause to put all the pieces together, it's almost inevitable that we'll misunderstand this word, and therefore we'll misunderstand this sentence about what we're talking about. So we did commitment. Let's talk about intrinsic truth. The critical thing about intrinsic truth is we've heard that phrase before in this very chapter. Nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. Right? That's the title of section A. And we've talked in previous weeks about how he in fact, that wasn't just a title, but he worked that theme all the way from the first sentence to the end of section A, beginning to end. It's throughout it. This is one of the core ideas that separates the classical worldview from our worldview. It's part of what makes them incomprehensible to us until we do the work we're doing now to learn to see what that is and how it works. So when he's talking about aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, part of what's here is, the things that we talked about before about phusis, about immanentalism of truth versus transcendentalism of truth, which then therefore gets into their monotheism versus polytheism. It's kataphusei is there. There is the rejection of both a parochial subjectivist experiential mode of life and also a rejection of an abstract objectivist intellectual mode of life, right? The rejection of the dualic way of knowing and the Banausic way of knowing is inherent to this concept of intrinsic truth. When we understand that intrinsic truth is tied to phusis, to becoming, right? That we're saying it's not a truth that we are free with our egos and wills to impose upon the world, the way a modern imagines things, but rather it is the truth of nature itself, according to nature, the authoritativeness of nature and its lawfulness that make it true. So, this tripartite notion of the mental faculties and how the human mind is structured is inherent in this phrase, intrinsic truth, and to the whole frame of the sentence so far. He's drawing off the entire human characterology he's developed in order to write this sentence. And part of what's core to this is this question of, for each character type, what is authoritative? For a doulos, what is authoritative is their experience of life. what they sense, what they feel, what they remember. For a Banausos, what is authoritative is their will, and specifically their will to submit their ideas to a systemic ideology and to be systematized in that, and to abstract from the world and suppress any part of the world that's not consistent with that ideology as an act of will, asserting that that makes it true because now it's consistent with my ideology. Now that I understand it, it has become truth. Both of these things, these form two opposites to the notion of intrinsic truth. We raised a question some months ago, which is if douloi are being driven by, if they're seeking truth and how to distinguish what's true and false on the basis of how they feel and experience the world, on the one hand, and if Banausoi, and if that's a trap, right? We recognize that that's a trap. And if Banausoi, on the other hand, are drawing the authoritativeness of how you distinguish what's true from what's false on the basis of their models and their education and their schemas on the other, that is their thoughts, right? We're doing a feelings versus thoughts, but in the richer sense, the Hegelian sense here. And we see that that's also a trap. Then the question that we raised is, where the hell do Aristoi get their authoritative sense of how to distinguish true and false? How do they decide what's right or what's true? I mean, if they're not doing it based on their feelings, and they're not doing it based on their thoughts, what's left? Where else could it be coming from? How can there be, this goes to the heart of the Hegelian question, how can there even be a third faculty of the mind? It's all well and good to say, well, we'll harness them both, but we've already acknowledged that either approach is a trap, and that even the truths that they have been warped out of recognition by being fit within the Dualic or the Banausic framework. So if all you're doing is cherry picking back and forth between Dualic insights and Banausic insights, you still don't have any truth. You just have a collection of warped pieces of truth that please you. And the argument is that Vernunft is something different, that that's not what it is. That to be an Aristos is not just that. But the question that we never answered before is, well, then what the hell is it? I mean, where could we possibly be looking for what's true? And what he's saying, so in this turn of phrase, in this use of the words intrinsic truth in this sentence, what he's saying is that an Aristos seeks truth neither in their thoughts nor in their feelings. They attend to both of those things, but they look for truth outside of the human animal, because the human animal cannot be trusted to be a vessel of truth. Cannot be trusted. It can be trusted to flee the truth into one of these two domains of idiotism, the realm of ideas, the self-insulating realm of ideas, or the self-insulating realm of experiences. But it can't be trusted to put those things aside and drive towards the truth if the truth is anywhere other than those two places. So you have to look outside yourself. And thus, what we're seeing here is this notion that there is a third source of truth, a third source of authority, other than thoughts and feelings. And that source of authority is the archai of the cosmos, the principles that generate nature. Those are a source of truth. They make everything. They have their own logic. It's not a human logic. It's not exactly humanly representable. And we have no direct access to it because as Heraclitus says, nature loves to hide. So those archai are hidden from us. They're under the surfaces of the trees and the rivers and the mountains. They're not the trees and rivers and mountains themselves. Those are just their fingerprints. And so the question then is, well, how can that possibly be a source of truth for a human being who is disconnected from it when it seems to be hiding from him? I mean, we have direct access to our experiences. We experience them. We have feelings and sensations and memories. And we have direct access to our thoughts and ideologies, but we don't have direct access to archai. So how can archai serve the function for Aristoi that experiences do for douloi and that ideologies and thoughts do for Banauso? How's that even possible? How does this even make sense and hold water? The answer is, this is why Aristoi have to wield both gnosis and noesis. They have to use them as imperfect tools to triangulate in a search not to confirm dualic or banausic presuppositions, but to upset them and overturn them. Anything that Douleia tells you, you know is false, at least in part. And anything Banausea tells you, you know is false, at least in part. So you pit them against each other, and you use them to search outside yourself in the cosmos for what are the underlying principles that drive things. And as you find and collect those principles or representations of them, that becomes your source of truth. But never in the tyrannical way that experiences are for Douloy, or thoughts and ideologies are for Banausoi. Only ever in a way that is simultaneously committed to the truth that there are archai out there, but hand in hand with the truth that those archai are not directly accessible to us, and we must always be searching. When he says aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, this goes hand in hand with his earlier statements about aristoi are committed to a life of agon, of struggle, because the third source of truth can only be searched for and approximated successively in a highly error-prone way by struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff in what we see in the world, and by separating the wheat from the chaff within ourselves, knowing that our inner nature is mendacious and pseudophilic. It is a struggle. The eristic mode, Vernunft, unlike the other two modes, is the uncomfortable mode. The other two modes are self-comforting, self-pleasing. They're trying to achieve a stasis. But the mode of Vernunft inherently has to be a struggle to search for things that we don't have a direct connection to, but that are nevertheless still more trustworthy than the things we do have a direct connection to, which are constantly misleading us. Do you see the structure, the Hegelian structure of this? Because if Verstand is developed as a negation of Begriff, and Vernunft is developed as a negation of Verstand, the negation of the negation, he says, it works through holding both Begriff and Verstand at arm's length and saying, I do have access to them. I have such easy access to them. Unlike a Banausos, I'm not going to cut myself off from my gnosis. And unlike with Begriff, I'm not going to cut myself off from my noesis. I'm going to have direct access to both of them, but I know they're both liars, and they're really good at it, and they're really seductive. And there have been times, and the only way you become an Aristos, there have been times in my life when I started out at an infantile level within the immersion of Begriff. And I fought my way out of that into what I thought was freedom, but turned out to be the immersion within the realm of ideas of Verstand. So I know at any moment I could easily, I will slide back into both of them because they're the easy paths. But they're both wrong. And so I have to search outside myself using these inadequate tools. This is the source of truth for an Aristos. This is why it's different in kind from the source of truth of a Banausos or a Doulos, and why, as a result of that, it is where the other two, RK, thank you for that link, where the other two modes are naturally self-narcotizing. The heuristic mode of Vernunft is naturally anti-self-narcotizing because that's its structure. Its structure is in the denial and skepticism of these two basal metabolic functions of the mind. Yeah, Jung talks about it some, but he's approximating the Greek. So aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth. Donald, go ahead.
I would say that the Aristos are capable of a kind of pointing but see the moon, see the arche, not the finger.
Right.
That that the truth in Plato and Aristotle is not the memorizing of verbalizations of true statements.
Right.
It's recognizing and being able to point and demonstrate behaviors. See how nature behaves here.
Yes.
See that, experience it. I mean, it's not, it combines the knowing and the experiencing.
Yes.
You know, it's a gnosis and noesis. Enough of that. But I think they often, like it's Aristotle. See, there's a good man over there. Go look at him.
Yeah, that's right.
Follow him around. It's not remembering what I've said about what it takes to be. It's the doing, the being, the pointing. It's an activity, not memorization.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the active pointing is critical. And, you know, part of what it is involved in this is a recognition that the reason we have these two basal metabolic faculties of the mind, the reason we have Begriff and Verstand, is that each of them gives us an indirect, but in some ways very real access to some aspects of the cosmos, to some aspects of Phusis. You know, we talk about the great Achilles heel of Verstand is the more abstracted you become, the more you miss out on things that are right in front of your nose that any doulos could point to because they feel it. It's real to them. And it has become unreal to the Benausos through the act of separation. And in that way, the shape of the blind spot within Verstand that is not a blind spot to Begriff tells us something about what's really in the world and about where our lacunae are, where we're missing things. The same is true the other way around. When we talk a lot about the flaws of Banausoi because Banausoi are in charge of everything in modernity, but Banausoi, I mean, more importantly, Verstand arose because it was needed within Homo sapiens. There are missing the forest for the trees patterns that are very common in Begriff, where the immediate experience overrides one's understanding that this is not the first time this has happened. There's a pattern of these things, and we could study not the thing, but the pattern of the things and start to get a broader understanding of the world. And that's a power that Verstand has that's pointing at something that's invisible but important in the world, that's not accessible through Begriff alone. And so in that, again, by looking at what the blind spot is for Begriff that is filled in by Verstand, we get something that points to an aspect of the world that we need to learn to recognize. And so this is part of why myth making, this heuristic function, is so important, because it's all about setting up examples to point to things in the world and say, just like Donald's saying, and say, don't listen not to me, but to the logos. And by the way, that is a quote I should have done a long time ago. I think that is like the very first fragment in Heraclitus. Let me see if I can pull it up right now. I think he uses the word listening. Yeah, there it is. There it is. Okay. Listening not to me, but to the logos. It is wise to acknowledge that all things are one. And there is a coherent system in the world. Not because I say so, don't listen to me, but because if you look at what I'm pointing at, you can experience it for yourself, and you can think about it and theorize about it for yourself. The only importance that I have is that I'm pointing you away from yourself and from me and out there to the realm of authority, kata fusei, that has these truths hidden within it, waiting for you to do the struggle to find them in there. So I'm glad that Donald mentioned this, because this helped. This was a real compliment to the way that I sort of described Vernunft. I described Vernunft in terms of the challenges and the struggle and the difficulty and the indirection. But what makes it work is that however hard it may be in here, we're actually talking about real things. This isn't the realm of beautiful ideas. This is the real world that really works in these sophisticated, amazing ways that are not obvious. And we can use Vernunft to steer people out of the labyrinth and back to experiencing the world, which has these things to teach them, if they can get out of the trap of Dulea or Bernauseia. So it doesn't matter that we struggle to figure out how to say it. And that therefore it would seem to lack authority or persuasiveness. It has the ultimate authority in that it's actually real. And this is why they're committed. This is why they're distinguished by this ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, because an Aristos has figured this out and fallen in love with the fact that this is the way out of these traps. There's so many other plausible ways to escape the twin traps of these mental faculties that don't work. But this one works. If you build wings and fly up into the dimension that the trap was never meant to hold, then you can escape the trap and fly to freedom. Anybody could learn that if they can experience it and can be taught to understand what's happening and can develop the faculties. This is ostensibly what the Greeks are saying with the myth of Daedalus, right? This is ostensibly what's going on. And this is why Aristoi are committed to that. And this is why the only people fit to govern, according to Aristotle, are Aristoi, because they're the only people who so far have discovered and fallen in love with and need this in their lives. And they need it so badly that they're willing to sacrifice all the things that people normally are completely committed to that make them sacrifice the things that matter. Aristoi are willing to set aside personal fame. They're willing to set aside wealth and riches. They're willing to do those. Not only are they willing to, they need to, because they've learned to hold those things in contempt, which we're gonna come to next. So far I've only taken us through the opening of the first sentence. It'll go faster after this, trust me. But this opening is so hard to pick apart, because although it is wielding all these tools that Kenneth Smith has given us to understand, it's wielding them all at the same time in a very dense construction. And the natural way for a modern to read this sentence is not to bring those things to bear, because every one of these words means something different to a modern, something easier that would allow us to just skim right through this sentence and go, oh, I understand. But the habit of understanding by misunderstanding in a characteristic way is so easy for us that even when we know we do it, we still do it anyway. That's why I'm slowing us down here today on this one. Oh, the myth of Talos. I mean, there's some great myths to work with here on this, absolutely. All right, the next word I'm going to slow us down on is visceral. Visceral. Ooh, visceral, he writes about this a lot. So, aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, so visceral. So visceral. Now, he's talking here about subjectivism. Subjectivity. Kenneth Smith has a lot of parables and essays in which he talks about the way that when he was in academia, he was regularly criticized and mocked by his fellows, or at least some of them, for being too subjectivist, for being emotionalist, for suggesting that myths might be an important thing, and for making value judgments. Because what they were taught to do in academic philosophy is to make no value judgments whatsoever, to have no personal investment in things, to not admit that you care at all about the subject, but merely to present it as though you were an oracle of a computer and you were merely reciting facts and logical syllogism and trains of thought. But no, you're not invested in it. And you leave it to the audience, which is, given how dryly the stuff is written, is only other academic philosophy professors. You leave it to the audience to decide for themselves what it means and whether they care. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're incompetent. That's what philosophy is considered to be in a modernist schema. Dry and evacuated of all the juice, because that is the noetic life, right? Noesis says left behind the juice of life within gnosis. So what he's saying is, The commitment that an Aristos makes to intrinsic truth is not an academic intellectual commitment. It is a gut level, emotionalist, subjectivist, driving need. It is all the things that a modern academic philosophy professor would tell you are inferior and contemptible and should not be done, that are wrong. Because in modernity, we scapegoat subjectivism, we scapegoat gnosis, and we say that is the source of all evil, right? We say the Holocaust was caused by anger or rage or bigotry. It's caused by emotions. And as we know, emotions are bad and evil. And if we could all be emotionless computers, surely utopia will follow. And so he's rejecting that. And he's saying, in effect, no Banausos is fit to rule. Anyone who successfully, and no one can successfully, but anyone who tries or believes they have successfully purged themselves of all these emotionalist, subjectivist value impurities is ipso facto unfit to govern. They have left behind all the things that matter. And Aristos combines the intellectualized understanding of the world with this visceral, driving, experiential understanding that the things of life matter. They have importance. They have juice, and we must do justice to those juices, or else everything we're saying is irrelevant and pointless and possibly leading us to evil. So visceral. This is why, I had to talk about visceral. Now, part of what that means is there's another theme here that Kenneth talks about a lot when he says that contempt is what the higher feels towards the lower, and resentment is what the lower feels towards the higher. Douloy and Banausoi resent being told they're not fit to govern. They resent it. And they resent anyone who claims that they are fit to govern. And they say, well, you're no better than us, right? You suck. If we suck, you suck too. Everybody's equal. You can't possibly be better. I'm a contrarian in the sense that I refuse to submit to anyone. And of course, what the resentful person fails to understand is they are submitting to their own inner demons, right? The demonisms of Begriff or the demonisms of Verstand. And they think that that constitutes freedom itself. They think that because they're free to do what they want, that means that they're free, not understanding that that means they're slaves of what they want. And likewise, they're free to think anything they want and follow any logic they want. They fail to understand how that makes them slaves of ideas and slaves of ideologies. And anyone who says that they have broken free of those things, that they just feel judged and they feel angry about it and they want to tear it down. You see this, says Kenneth Smith, in the writings of Diogenes Laertius, who is unfortunately one of our main sources on a lot of philosophers. And where you see it is Diogenes Laertius does an okay job in quoting people's ideas and philosophies, but when he describes the biographies, he gives each of these philosophers an ironic, resentful death. The philosopher who says everything flows dies of not having things flow, dropsy, said Diogenes Laertius. For each of the philosophers, Diogenes Laertius laid up one of these deaths for them, and then claimed that that's how they really died. Or sometimes he'll say, some say that he died that way, while others say he died this way. But in all of that, what he's doing is he's harnessing an enormous literature that's mostly lost to us, but that a number of classical writers, a number of people who write in a contemporary sense about classical period have figured out, they have inferred that there was a literature of resentment in which, Douloy and Banausoi would write scathing mockeries of Aristoi because they felt such resentment towards them. And you see some of that in some of the comedies that survive to this day. In The Clouds, right? Aristophanes really has a go at Socrates. And Socrates comes across as just as contemptible a figure as anybody you might meet in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. So all of this includes the whole literature of, oh, you think you're so great, well, you'll just end up just as bad as I do. Goes hand in hand with Diogenes Laertius, is giving each of these philosophers an ironic death. It's resentment. There is an emotionalism to that. Now, in the modern sense, we might say, well, sure, those lower people are all emotionalist, but the upper people shouldn't be emotionalist. They should be above it all. They should be floating in a cloud of intellectual ideas, which, of course, if you've read Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift had to go at them too. who each had to be accompanied by a flapper who flapped them about the heads and shoulders to remind them to do things like, eat or drink water or not to walk off a cliff while they were wandering about in their realm of beautiful, fine ideas. And, what Kenneth Smith says is that an Aristos also is emotional, also is full of the juices, and they feel towards the lower a contempt. They don't have an objective relationship to the Dualic or Banausic life forms because they had to fight out of those. They had to struggle their whole life to get out of the gravity traps, the relentless, seductive gravity traps of Dulea and Banausea, which are constantly offering them all the things that they could possibly want. Their own internal psyche is relentlessly trying to seduce them with Placida to lure them out of Vernunft and back into Verstand and Begriff. It's a never-ending dialogue within the mind of an Aristos, because the Aristic mind is built atop these earlier, more core structures of the mind. You know what I mean? You can't dispense with them any more than once you've built the third story of your house, you decide to get rid of the foundation and the second story. You say, I'll just throw those away and I'll just hover here, defying gravity. That's not how architecture works. That's not how forces work. You have to remain in conflict with those lower forces to prop you up. Otherwise, you'd collapse. And ergo, since they have juices to pull you down inside of you, you working as an Aristos at the Vernunft level have to have equal juices to work against them and to harness them to your purposes. Because if you don't, then you're not strong enough and you fall back into being one of the other types. So, when you're a kid, you do all kinds of awful things, especially as an infant. You do all kinds of awful things you never, ever want to do again. And of course, one of the tragedies of old age is that sometimes you find yourself doing some of those things again. It's sort of, people talk about the sort of the pain, the existential pain of being reduced in certain ways to an infant again, especially if you get into senility, if you lose control of your bowels again at a certain age. These things are humiliating to us because how did we learn to stop doing them as infants when we became children? We did it through shame and contempt. We learned that it's shameful to pee your pants. It's shameful to poop yourself, right? We may not like to think about the strength of that shame, but as adults, part of the reason why we are not at this very moment peeing and pooping ourselves is because there is an architecture of contempt within us that says it's gross, don't do it. I don't care if I'd rather stay here in this conversation than have to interrupt it and run off to the bathroom. I'm not going to go to the bathroom right here, right? I might feel an urge to belch. I might have eaten food, right? And I really want to go brack, right? But I'm having a presentation. I don't want to shame myself. That impulse within me, which I gave into as an infant, I resist it through contempt now. Contempt is the emotional alchemy. It is the product of emotional alchemy that turns the good feelings and urges and desires to do these things that come naturally to us into a negation that's strong enough to keep us from doing those things, even though somewhere within us is a little infant going, oh, come on, I want to. It would feel great. Let's do it. So when he says visceral here, he's alluding to this issue of contempt and resentment. And he's saying that an Aristos is propping themselves up internally through this architecture of shame and disgust toward their own willingness to be seduced by the worst parts of myself and by the part of themselves that is doing the seducing and trying to pull us back down to that level. There is a powerful emotional strength. And an intellectual, a Banausos, has this same architecture, but is in denial about it, right? They think that they're a creature, they think they're a Vulcan, a creature which they misunderstand to be a creature of intellect and reason. And they don't understand how much of their intellect and reasoning is driven by their unconscious emotional desires. They haven't yet learned to admit to themselves the architecture of their own mind. And as a result, they're still a prisoner of it. That's part of how it becomes a trap. But the Aristos, in order to commit themselves to intrinsic truth, in order to have this ethos, they have to be more honest about the unpleasant parts of themselves that make them go. I'm going to call on you guys in a sec, but the punchline to this is the way that you know it must be so is, as we've said, the cosmos is infinities upon infinities upon infinities of nuance and subtlety that matter in distinguishing what's real from what's not real. But the human being is finite. We only live so long. We can only learn so much. We can't possibly fully represent what's out there in here. We can't. And if we're not willing to be open and honest about that shameful truth, that even our very best philosophies and theories are riddled with errors. If we're not willing to say that, then we devolve into being Banausoi, who fall in love with our realm of ideas and start to think that it's the truth itself when it's not. That is part of what distinguishes us, that willingness to come to grips with the juices, with the shame. All right, Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, well, as part of my arguments with the rationalists or the humanists has always been that if you guys say that there is no God, how do we know we can trust our reason? If our reason is purely a product of evolution, then it's likely full of holes. And David Miller is always pointing out the problem that he finds with the humanists, and they've got this idea of being the technocrats, is they want certainty. Above all, they want certainty. They're not willing to risk anything which is uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that might be just part and parcel of life. But I was going to bring up the other question. That's a question of where the Western and Eastern churches began to divide. And one issue they divided over was the nature and constitution of what man is.
Yes.
Now, the Western Church wanted a definition where man is a creature with a soul above the animals. But this is the point. Animals have thoughts and feelings, but it's only man who can stand back and objectify their thoughts and feelings.
Right.
But they went on, you know, a step further, is what the Greek church was unhappy, that the Western church was saying reason was the highest faculty that the common man had.
Exactly.
And the Eastern church reserved and said, no, they're talking about the archive, that every common man has an element to engage the archive, no matter how small.
That's right.
But the Western church said, no. Only the Pope can decide.
Yes. Yes.
It's also the condition was that the Pope was only meant to be the first among equals for the patriarchs and not assume a dominant position. And that was the big struggle that was occurring in the church. And yeah, that sort of fascinates me, because Jung points to the nature of the archetype, and it's painful. It's easy to live with thoughts and feelings, but when you come up against these concepts of the archetypes,
yes,
it hurts.
It hurts.
It pains your mind. It's no longer a walk in the park.
That's right.
As it was with just feeling and thoughts. I say to people, people say, what's the best way of getting the things I want in life? If I'm a man, I've got a heart on, I want a woman, I want a nice house, I want a nice job, I want a flash car. But, I always ask them, well, what made you want those things in the first place? Is it such a good idea?
Mm-hmm.
It's like the old man, the young men, are saying, "Oh, let's go after all the women," and the old man saying, "If we hide, we might be able to avoid them."
Yeah, right.
And people don't think about this one. Are you really sure that this thing you think you want is such a great idea?
Right. Right. Yeah. Very Heraclitean there, Stephen.
Yeah, so I always want to go back to this convention in 869, which was the Western Church wanted, but the Eastern Church rejected. Because, for example, you know, in the Eastern Church, monks will engage in Oriental breathing exercises to engage the spirit.
Right.
Whereas the Western Church will say, no, 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 you're not getting into any of that. Just do what the Pope tells you. You have your own little trip. You're a man on the earth. You have feelings. You have thoughts. Yeah, you can do that, but you cannot approach the archive. Only the directive of the Pope works there.
Right.
And this is one of the splits in the church.
Right. Boy, I'm glad you brought that up. You know, and that's so fundamental, because in that the Eastern Orthodox Church is keeping more of the original classical concept that the truth may be really hard to get at. These archive may be really elusive, but there's not an infinite gulf between man and the truth. There are things that you can do to do a better job, like the breathing exercises, for example. There's things you can do to tune yourself up to pay more attention, because as they said, everybody has some gnosis within them that could give them some kind of indirect access. But the Western Church wanted to erect an infinite gulf between God and man. And the only way to do that was to absolutely trample the human mind and say, you have no capacity to get to the truth unless it is given to you by God. And since, you know, God's over there, it will be the Pope who will give you God's truth. And then the purpose of your reason, therefore, becomes not to help you diagnose your misunderstandings and approach the truth. It is to rationalize what we've already told you to think. You can use your intellect to construct rationalizations that make our order sound better to you and to us, and then we can share your rationalizations. But they should absolutely never be used the other way around. You should never use your intellect, for example, to critique whether the reason I gave you that order is because I'm actually corrupt and want all your money. I mean, you know, you're not allowed to use it in any way other than to rationalize obedience. And you could see why there'd be a schism. I mean, I'd schism over that. That's yeah, well, thank you for bringing that up. It's a critical topic. Phil and then Ginny, and then we'll see how much more of this we can do today.
Yeah, I want to ask a question. So this is a question posed to you about the relationship with the third.
Yes.
And if you have these two inputs, it seems to me there's at least two ways I'm thinking about. One is that it's an overlay. The other one is a triangulation. And they have very different meanings to me. It seems to me triangulation is kind of like the two eyes that looks at the same thing from slightly different angles, and they synthesize it as one thing, the real thing, in quotes. An overlay is something in which it remains the difference between the 2 points of view. And what happened is that the mind looks at the juxtaposition of the difference. And from that juxtaposition, it creates the third.
Yes.
It's a different thing.
Yes.
Which has more to do with creativity, and the other one has more to do with representation. It seems to me you're kind of presenting the representation as the road to the truth, when both are, in a sense, internal. It may be related to the external, but nonetheless is subjective. And I wonder whether you could interpose between that. I mean, the senses do actually do a pretty good job. And I wonder whether the overlay is not a different way to look at it. I'll give you an example. I remember when I was interviewing for a job, it was at what is it? Youngstown State. And, in interviewing, you have to talk to the dean. And the dean apparently thought that I was a reasonably smart guy. So he asked me a pretty deep question. Well, not that deep, but I think he asked me a trick question, because the dean came from music and I was in visual arts. And he says, Phil, what is the difference between painting, let's say, and music? Right?
Yeah.
I guess a pretty fundamental question if you're a dean of a college of fine and performing arts. You want to have some understanding of that. And I told him, like, well, the problem with the visual arts is that it comes from vision, from sight, from seeing. And the seeing has a way of objectifying the reality. So we
Yes.
believe the object is real.
Yes.
So the problem with that is that when you're doing a creative thing, in a sense, you have to break down the real to get at a deeper thing in order to create an abstraction that you could now synthesize juxtapose in a kind of poetic form.
Yes.
Whereas music has the luck of, let's say, because we don't utilize it as a functional sense that much, it exists in a very special place that it has enough sensitivity to have a lot of nuance, but it exists in a kind of floating world. I call it floating world.
Yeah.
In which is able to hear the harmonies of, let's say, the universe, instead of objectifying it.
Yes.
That's much looser. And it seems to me those have different attributes. And, and I'm thinking the overlay, which is sort of like retaining the difference, but retaining the ambiguity between them, is a very different thing than the parallax, which produces objectification. The problem with the parallax, and I'm thinking, is that, yes, you could. It is actually true that the eyes could objectify two different things and synthesize it as one thing, as a whole. And you believe that, okay? The problem with using parallax is that it only works at a near distance.
Yeah.
Before it falls into a monovision of sorts,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I wonder whether the objectification isn't something that we are so tied to that we could only project into the near future. And we have very little understanding, if any, into the far. And then we're forced into a situation where we want to objectify, but we can't objectify because it's just too far in the future. Whereas something like music didn't have that problem, because it was never about objectification.
Right.
It was about an overlay.
Right.
And so those are very, very different approaches to aesthetic. It took the visual arts a long time to break down the objectification, because we want to imitate what we actually see in a functional world.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
we don't want to bump into a tree.
Right.
I mean,
just see it coming.
And so we're burdened with this objective thing. And I wonder whether, for instance, seeing written words does not already put you closer to objectification rather than
Yes.
hearing words,
It does.
which is much more ambiguous. And so I just wonder if what you want in a dialectic is to create the negation to get to a deeper truth, then do you want to confront a world which is objectified in nouns, rather than verbs. And
Mhm.
why haven't we developed a language which its main emphasis is in the verb rather than the noun?
Yeah.
Because if it's about relationships, it's quite different. So
Yeah.
we might be constrained by our very nature of a construct of what we are.
Yeah.
So that's why I want to point out the difference and ask you to say something about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is right on the money, man. This is the good stuff. You know, part of what Hegel's arguing throughout his philosophy is that these realms that we thought were separate realms, like thinking and having a personality and having a culture and having a history, and below that having a biology, they aren't separate realms. That each one is shaping the one above it. In fact, the one above it can only possibly, in the realm of nature, it can only possibly arise from the foundations created below it. You know, it's not, they can't be incompatible with each other. And that's what he's doing to Kant when he's transforming Kant's ideas into his own, is he's trying to reset these organic relationships of growth and transformation in order to create some coherency among these things. And so what you're doing, tying the senses to the forms of thinking that follow naturally from them, I mean, it's inescapable, right? I mean, people have said that although the phrase goes, seeing is believing, in fact, for many people, touching is a more profound form of believing, which is why when people are in absolute disbelief, even when they're looking at something, they'll reach out and touch it because they need the immersion and the experience that touching is better at to draw them out of their ideas into this unexpected reality that their intellect is struggling to accept. Same is true of smelling. Why is smelling so potent at bringing back vivid memories? It's the one sense that unlike the others, it short circuits one of the paths that the other four take through the brain and goes right to the heart of things, goes right to the white matter. And it can summon up a memory immediately. It's more experiential. I like to think about the difference between, if you look at the evolution of animals and the development of the senses, it's interesting how smell and touch go back to even single-celled animals have smell and touch. And we've seen the prodigious things that a slime mold can accomplish with those alone using somaticity. But what a lot of people don't quite grok is that there is a primitive form of seeing, or what I might call a more basal form of seeing rather than primitive, that even a single cell can have. What a single cell can't do is generate an image and understand it as something outside of itself. That objectification you're talking about requires some sophisticated construction. But what it can do is sense light and dark, and it can sense movement. That's sort of the foundational level of vision that then gets replicated at a multicellular level to create eyes. Jellyfish, for example, there are jellyfish that have the sense of light and darkness or movement, but can't create an image. And there are other jellyfish that have actual eyes with lenses, and they can actually create an image and sense the thing outside themselves and where it is. And these are, what's interesting about them is the way that the more basal form of vision is every bit as immersive as touch and smell, right? Because you're not seeing a picture of anything anywhere. It's like our attempt to represent that is to say that the jellyfish can sense if it's light or it's dark. But if it's more like smell or touch, then probably to the jellyfish, it's more like whether I'm light or I'm dark than whether it is light or dark, because there's no it. The jellyfish that can't create an image is immersed in the light and darkness, just like they are immersed in what they smell or taste or touch. And so it's a begriff mode. But once they start forming images, and by the way, the ones that, although musculature begins to develop even before the creation of an eye that can make an image, it really accelerates in jellyfish once they can start to form images. When they have actual eyes, they develop a whole lot more musculature until you get to the sea wasp, which can actually pursue fish and catch them. Its vision is so good, its sense of the environment and that there's other things that exist, the sense of a self and another and so on. But what's fascinating is that along with that level of evolution comes the evolution of sleep. Turns out whatever's going on, when you're objectifying the world and creating self and other and tracking all of that, you got to go dormant a certain amount of every day because it's just too much. Your brain, they don't have a brain, right? But they've got nervous tissue, but the nervous tissue and the muscles and whatever else is involved, it's got to clean itself out regularly or else it can't do it anymore. Objectification comes at a price. It's expensive, and it traces all the way down to our root anatomy, not just our sense organs, but the fact that the sense organs and musculature and nervous tissue all evolved together in a feedback loop. As one advanced, the others advanced with it. This goes to what you're saying, that there are these foundational relationships, and that Hegel's probably right, that the capacity to do noesis is probably related to the capacity to have vision that can form an image. And gnosis probably has these older roots, these deeper roots, and that if the roots go that far, he's probably right that it then goes from, if you lean heavily into one of the faculties, that's going to shape your personality, what kind of character you have, and how you're going to see the world, from which cultures and history follow. It's a fascinating kind of organismic way of seeing the relationships. Ginny, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Ginny.
Going with your biology, just sidetracking just a bit. Have you heard about this? They've discovered a new bacteria that is not microscopic, but like 600 times bigger than a regular bacteria. Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
Oh, and do they know what kind of damage this bacteria may cause to human race? Have they?
Yeah. Could be a boon. Who knows?
Oh, okay. I was just wondering if you've heard of it.
Remember, we couldn't digest without bacteria. So, the question of the relationship between us and the bacteria is a good one, but it could go either way or both.
Okay.
So
you have heard about it. Huh?
Yeah, most likely that bacteria doesn't have any direct relationship to us. It's probably that size because of all the more complex relationships it can have to the world if it's got so much more a membrane to work with. One of the most interesting things about the differences between bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, we're all eukaryotes, is that bacteria and archaea are tiny compared to eukaryote cells. Our cells in our body are like monsters compared to bacteria cells or archaea cells. Those things are teeny. And part of the reason for that is that eukaryotes, they've gone from treating the membrane as a protection. It's just a capsule that protects my good bits from the world. Eukaryotes have developed a membrane that becomes the basis for symathesy. It's a prehensile membrane that reaches out and interacts with the world around it. The amoeba is the classic example of a eukaryote, where it's not just hiding in its little shell and multiplying and doing what it can. It's actually engaging with the world and interacting with it. But that requires, the more membrane you have, it's like the more fingers you have. And so there's a big advantage to growing as a eukaryote that isn't an advantage normally for a bacteria or an archaea, because they're just trying to keep themselves, encapsulated. So I got to think that what we're going to discover in the case of this really large bacteria is that it must be, developing that prehensile membrane. The reason for that size is to reach more of the world and to be able to interact with it. We know that eukaryotes we're a synthesis of some of the previous life forms, right? We know that our mitochondria, that are the powerhouse of a eukaryote cell, we know that started as a bacterium or an archaean. And some of our other organelles that are inside our cells likewise started as separate, and that they joined together. So there's a good chance that that large prehensile membrane that we have in all our cells, it probably started in the realm of bacteria and archaea. this thing that they found might be the descendant of one of the ancestors that, led to us. That's where I get excited about this.
I'm just always just the kind of things and the variety of information that Rick, is just always just astounding. It's just like, what? I mean, he knows about this and that and that and that and that and that. Okay, Rick. Anyway,
I have enormous numbers of blind spots, I assure you. There's so many things I don't know very well.
Well, and then I also wanted to, going back several conversations back, your use of the word contempt, relating to bodily noise and I thought it was just very interesting that you chose the word contempt, or was it Kenneth Smith? It was Kenneth Smith who used that word. Okay.
Contempt versus resentment.
Shameful. It was really interesting the way why I used the word. He used the word shameful. Anyway, that was going way back in conversation. But since we raised our hands to be recognized, I couldn't talk about it as it was happening. So
I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because Freud also says that our psychology involves an enormous architecture of shame that we're normally not conscious of. There's like this unconscious architecture to our mind that makes us able to function. And this is one of the places where Kenneth Smith, who normally has plenty of critical things to say about Freud, it's one of the places.
The thing is, we as human beings don't think that we are feeling shameful. All right. I mean, do we really? I mean, most people, maybe a few percentage, small percentage of people may think that word, think about that concept, but I can't imagine that most people would, I'm shameful that I'm thinking this or saying this or whatever. I don't know.
We've mostly forgotten it. This is that thing about how the structure of the mind involves the struggles that we're having to understand the world right now are very conscious. We're trying to figure things out. But once they become familiar to us, they recede into our unconscious. The scope of our mind grows, and now we have a new frontier of things that we're conscious of. And the things that used to be our central preoccupations, we forget about them. But they're still in there. They're not like absent just because they're not conscious. And so the unconscious part grows and grows and grows until eventually we've forgotten most of the things we had to struggle through to get to the point that we're at in our lives. I'm lucky enough, I guess, that I have a lot of keen memories from when I was very little. And I remember what it's like to pee yourself at school, when you're really little, like first grade or kindergarten, and you thought you had it all under control, and then, oh no, the feeling of, oh no, the panic and shame that's associated with, I was having a happy, warm thought, and then suddenly I was happy and warm, and then I was ashamed. We forget that as adults because it's embarrassing.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you just said. You were shameful about what? Shameful about what?
When you're like in kindergarten,
and
you have an accident.
Yeah.
Most people have forgotten that.
You remember having.
I remember what that feels like.
Oh, that felt like? You remember how it felt like? Oh.
Yeah.
And
because of that,
it's interesting because, sometimes in fact, here and there, I want to ask my son, during that moment when you were, let's say, 3 or 4 years old, and you did blah, 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 what was really going through your brain, your mind? I want to ask him. And this is kind of maybe a little silly or embarrassing, but I have to, he was about 2 years old, and I went and said, honey, blah, blah, blah. I was right next to his face. This is in the morning, and when I had just recently woken up, and he looked at me, and he had that look of, Mommy, you have a bad breath, but he didn't know to say that word to me. You know what I mean? But he gave me this look as though like, but like now I want to say, what were you thinking? When you were looking at me, that was so funny like that.
Yes.
And there's been moments like that, several moments, and I want to ask him, do you remember what you were thinking?
Right. And mostly we forget, right? And I've forgotten most of my life, just like anybody else does. I mean, the notion of becoming fully conscious is a misguided notion, because it is our unconscious that allows us to do so much so quickly. and we're able to work at the level we are because we don't have to think about most of it, like riding a bike. If we became fully conscious, we'd be paralyzed. We're like, well, now I have to think again about how do I move without poking myself in the eye, and how do I think about how to digest an apple, all these things, right? So yeah, but I don't know, I'm wired in such a way I remember a few early things like the shame of that. And as a
How old do you
result,
think you were though? Were you 2 years old, 3 years old? How do you remember how old you were?
first grade.
First grade. Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
Those memories, I think, people do have memories from that.
I
Yeah.
can remember a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm wired in such a way that I like to remember the unpleasant things, not just the pleasant things. Most people would rather forget them. And so they're sort of shoving them down into the unconscious, but I have an appetite for remembering the unpleasant things as well. And that makes it easier to remember. And as a result, it means that when I look at my behavior now, I can triangulate and figure out that there's still all kinds of shame going on. I'm just not consciously feeling it anymore. It's part of the automatic process of, how I go about my life. Anyway, why don't I see if I can get us to the end of this first sentence. Thanks, Ginny. I'll see if I can get us to the end of this first sentence. I only have a few more words and terms to go, and we'll be there. But I hope you can see why I decided to slow down and anatomize his use of vocabulary here, because he's really pulling everything together into these three sentences. There's a huge amount there, and the key takeaway from this is that this is how most of his writing is. This is how dense and chewy and how much he's thinking about and putting into his sentences, even though we don't pick up on most of it when we're reading it later. But I'm hoping that you can see how I can point out the use of the word intrinsic truth here isn't just some phrase he picked. It's exactly the phrase that he picked for the title of section A. And he picked it because he's taking the entire content of section A and squeezing it down right into this sentence in order to bring all that meaning to bear to make this sentence mean more things. And in doing this, he's following Nietzsche and Heraclitus, who are among his heroes, for their ability to compress enormous amounts of meaning into a small space. So aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, so visceral. I'll finish the sentence and then we'll break down the last couple words. So visceral, it must be elusive to the inventive and narcotized minds of ordinary men. Let's trace through the last couple bits here. So the next one is elusive. Well, first, the other thing about visceral, about why the emotional commitment, the contempt is so important, is because the only way that the Aristos can stay free sometimes of the gravity wells and demonisms and seductions of their own Begriff and their own Verstand is to anatomize and understand the many tricks that their mind try to play on them with the same level of interest and commitment and caring that we feel about not stepping into nettles or on a thorn or touching a hot stove or picking a strawberry and putting it in our mouth. That same level of investment and involvement and emotional juices and commitment that leads us to not step in front of a truck by accident. An Aristos has to do that with the nature inside themselves as well, because if they don't, then by definition, they're either a doulos or a benausos. If you don't do those things, if you don't make your inner nature real to you and learn all its tricks and learn how to evade it, then it will catch you and you will become a doulos or a benausos. That's why people become douloi and benausoi, because it's easy to do. It's inevitable to do. It's almost impossible to escape unless you learn its tricks. If you learn its tricks, then it's like going to a carny and you know that they're there to con you. Oh, come here, I'll do this magic trick. It's 3-card Monty. I'm sure you'll be clever enough to beat it. And you maybe the first few times you fall for it, but after that you're like, no, I see what you're doing there, right? You learned that the guy with the 3-card Monty has a trick and he's going to beat you no matter how smart you think you are. So you don't play that trick. But if you don't know he's there, or you don't pay attention to whether he's there, then he's going to beat you again. And that's how our own Dulic and Banausic impulses inside us are. They always have the 3-card Monte trick ready to go. They have a whole bunch of tricks. They're really clever. They're really seductive, and that's why most people fall for it. So to be an Aristos, you have to learn how all of that works. And it's why he spends so much time describing Dulea and Banausea and modernity and how they work. It's not because he's negative. It's what Phil said. It's because he's positive. He's trying to show you how, if you can learn these things, then you can avoid falling prey to them. And that creates a little zone of freedom within which you could start to behave like an Aristos. So, okay, commitment to visceral. So the next word is elusive. Elusive. Elusive is important here. To break this sentence down to the core pieces, he's saying that ethos is elusive to ordinary men. And the reason that ethos is elusive to ordinary men is that their inventive and narcotized minds make it impossible for them to even conceive of that ethos. So an ordinary person can't understand what an Aristos is, because the most central defining characteristic of an Aristos doesn't exist in the world of a doulos or a Banausos. There's no such thing. And not no such thing like a dragon or a unicorn where you point at it and go, that's not a real thing, but no such thing like someone who's never met a con man who's going to play 3-card Monte before. It's that you literally have never imagined it before. And the way that you go about thinking and imagining things follows the certain tracks that are built for you by Dulea and Banausea in such a way that you will never think those thoughts. They're just not going to occur to you. Your brain doesn't run on those tracks. The tracks of your brain don't go to those destinations. The concept of an ethos, the concept of intrinsic truth, the concept of freedom and determinism that could lead to this sort of commitment, the concept of a higher form of thinking that simultaneously involves this visceral level that is disgusting to Banausoi, all of that put together is an incomprehensible, unstatable, unthinkable thing to the inventive, narcotized minds of ordinary people. And therefore, it's elusive. They can't get a grasp on it because they can't even conceive of it or think about it or talk about it. They don't have the words, they don't have the thoughts, they don't have the habits, they don't have the experience, and it doesn't fit in their ideologies. There's no place for it. So it's as good as not existing. You can't talk about elusive, which implies hiding, without, and you'll notice a recurring theme here of Heraclitus. This is not an accident. Phusis cryptosthai phile. Nature loves to hide. One of Heraclitus's classic lines. Nature loves to hide. And we've talked about it several times today from the concept of the archai are hard to pin down. What's actually making the universe go is invisible to us. It's generating all this stuff, but it's the principles that are underneath it and we have no direct access to them. But when he says nature loves to hide, of course, he's partly saying that, but partly he's saying the structure of the human mind is such that the most important parts of nature are hidden from it. That is, nature isn't trying to trip us up. It's just that we've evolved in such a way that the most important things are not obvious to us. And the things that are obvious to us are not the most important things. It's why he's also got that line that says, the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither conceals nor reveals, but gives signs. So this is his companion piece to Nature Loves to Hide, where he says, okay, it doesn't really love to hide. It's not hiding, but it's also not putting things out in the open where we can find them. And we're thinking in such a way that anything that isn't obvious to us, we think doesn't exist. So this is what he means here by elusive. He's trying to emphasize this. There is this line. If people are game, I want to go to quarter after, because I'll stop with elusive today. I'm not going to try to take us through the whole thing, but there's some good juicy bits here on elusive. It's really good. So he's got this line that says the perfect trap is for escape from that trap to be incomprehensible, so that you don't even know you're in a trap. If you know you're in a trap, you might try to get out of it. But if you have no idea you're in a trap, you'll stay in it. You won't take the actions you need to take to get out of it. So the best trap doesn't tell you that it's a trap. The best trap looks like either normal life or something really good that you want, right? In otherwise, parable 41, invisibility, reads as follows. The perfect invisibility is inconceivability. What humans cannot bring themselves to believe or to comprehend is as good as nothing. I'll pop that into the quotes here. That's obviously directly relevant here. When we're talking about elusive, again, this alludes to nature loves to hide, because we're saying it's not that the ethos of Aristotle is in any way attempting to evade them. It's that they are structured in such a way that they can't conceive of such a thing, and therefore it is hidden from them perfectly. So this emphasizes this idea of the labyrinth in which we are trapped, not as a cage in which we feel trapped. That's sort of an entry-level understanding. That's what the myths say. Theseus knows he's walking into a labyrinth, right? The Athenian youth sent to Crete to be sacrificed to the Minotaur, they know they're entering a labyrinth. But when you look at the rest of the myths of the labyrinth, it's clear that it's something a lot subtler than that. That what Minos commissioned Daedalus to build is a maze that's so cunning that it defeats the human mind, and the very tools you're trying to use to get out of it don't work anymore. If you always turn left to try to get out using that recipe, you stay inside it. If you always turn right to try to get out of it, you stay inside it. It's cleverer than that. It's cleverer than you are, and it defeats your stratagems. And as long as you follow your stratagems to try to escape it, you'll be stuck within it. That's the original conception. And the way that you know is, he says in the myths that the first prisoner of the labyrinth was Daedalus himself. And even though he built the labyrinth, nobody in the world knew more about the labyrinth than he did. Even he couldn't get out of it. It even destroyed his own intelligence and his own ability to escape it. His stratagems fell apart. And that's where the personal level of the myth comes into play. This is where the deep level of the myth is. That the architect of the labyrinth is entrapping himself. And he's entrapping himself in such a way that he can't get out of it. And the perfect trap is a trap that you don't know you're building. So the deep myth of the labyrinth and Daedalus is that each of us, through our normal acts of thinking and feeling, through the activities of our mind, are constructing a labyrinth that we can't get out of because we don't know we're doing it. We don't know we're in a labyrinth. And every time that we follow the trails that lead from one proposition to a conclusion, we still find ourselves inside the labyrinth. We can't reach a conclusion that takes us outside of us unless we have a transcendental experience of some kind that overcomes, that is in a new dimension that we didn't conceive of when we built the labyrinth. This is the power of ceteris paribus in science. This is when people critique science in its current form as being a banausic form, a self-entrapping form. What they're saying is that the basis of all scientific theories is the statement, all else being equal. All else being equal, what I'm going to say is true. But who is in a position to know if all else is equal? And so what occurs in ceteris paribus is an act of nescience in which we suppress almost all of the world, and we're left with only the clean, tidy parts in which our theory makes sense. And thus we've constructed a little labyrinth for ourselves, a little clean space set off from the world, in which as long as you stay inside the clean space, you can't get out of it. The theory seems to explain everything. You're done, right? It's complete. You can't sense what's missing from within the framework of ceteris paribus, because by definition, ceteris paribus is about suppressing everything else and preventing it from being brought in to show where your theory has flaws. There is an insulating activity that happens here. And this is the core to the way that the human mind works. When he's talking about elusiveness here, he's talking about the way that people their minds have grown into such a shape that this thing has no place within the labyrinth. And so it can't be conceived of. In this, he's talking about the faculty of nescience. We talk a lot about intelligence as something that leads us to the truth, that lets us perceive things that are real and to understand their nature. But Kenneth Smith and Hegel and others argue that at least as important as that form of intelligence is nescience, which is the ability not to see things, the ability to make things disappear out of the picture. Nescience is what an infant goes through when they learn to see. right? People who have grown up as adults, who are intelligent, who never had the ability to see, who had their vision given to them for the first time, say that the world looks like a curtain pressed against your face, and it's all full of colors and shapes, and you don't know why. And sometimes when you walk forward, you run into a wall, and sometimes when you walk forward, you don't, and you cross the room, and you don't know what happens. Why do some of the colors give way and other colors don't? What is happening with vision is something that we have to learn. And so what we learn is how to suppress the things that don't matter and bring to our attention the things that do. And that lets us see the world at all. Before that, we don't see the world. We just see this kaleidoscope that makes no sense. The act of vision involves the act of nescience. It is the suppression that lets us pick out what matters from what doesn't, that lets us navigate a room and not trip and bark our shins on the little table at the edge, right? We learn to watch for the corner of the table, and we learn not to worry about the other things that we know aren't threats to our steps. So nescience is built right in at a low level of perception. It certainly manifests in every act of thinking or feeling we ever do. We're attending to some things and we're suppressing others. And the scientific principle of ceteris paribus is a way of rationalizing nescience as saying, as long as we ignore almost everything, this theory works great. We just have to move it out of the realm of reality into the perfect, pure, abstracted world of science, of noesis, effectively. When we do this, when we engage in nescience, when we do the foreground background thing, when we do ceteris paribus, what we create in our understanding of the world is lacunae, which is a term that comes from the study of old manuscripts, where a manuscript may be damaged and we're missing 4 words, and we'll never know what those 4 words are because they're gone now. That document was torn there, or it has a hole. And so the document that we have left is a construction that involves only part of the original document, with all these lacunae within it of things that have dropped out because of history, and they aren't available to us anymore. The challenge for us is that the pattern forming structure of the brain is such that we don't see the lacunae in our own perception of the world the way that we can see them in a torn document. In a torn document, you can see the tears and the holes and say, I'm missing this and this and this. And we can try to guess about what might be in there. But in the creation of consciousness and a worldview, the lacunae vanish and we think we have a complete text. And we rationalize it so that it makes sense as though there were no lacunae, as though nothing is missing. And that is exactly the process by which our consciousness creates an envelope that separates us from the world. Because now there's things that are missing, and we don't believe we're missing anything. Not only are they not there, we know it's not the case that something's not there. So we have erased the missingness of them, and we now think we have a complete worldview. That's why most people can't imagine this ethos of an Aristos, because the way they see the world creates lacunae that erase the very things that are the most important to an Aristos. So there can't be a person who's motivated by those things and cares about those things, because those aren't things. They're not things we disagree with. They're not things at all. They're lacunae. They're inconceivables. They're surds. They're inexpressible in the framework of the person who's thinking. So I end up here with a couple of quotes. Here's one from Otherwise. This is Otherwise 79, called Interruptus. There was a people fated to want to be happy. They were not fated to be happy, of course, and so they weren't. They had no idea what would actually make them happy, and no idea how to discriminate which of the many ways of trying to be happy was truly best and wisest. But they were fated, in the midst of so much intellectual poverty, to take the pursuit of happiness as an absolute obligation, as a righteous religious dogma. Their sole philosophical talent lay in an intuitive hypersensitivity to any topic cast in the key of tragedy, despair, gravity, or any degree of seriousness whatsoever. For their fate had predestined them to home in on the prospect of fun, free of all cares and consequences. This talent made them constitutionally allergic to the raising of philosophical issues or historical perspectives that might spoil their appetites for consuming fun or for making money with which to buy the promise of fun. The issues of life, of what it might mean to be human or rational or spiritual, quite passed this people by, just as the tides roll in and out unnoticed by people watching television by the seashore. Because they could not speak or think philosophically, and their entire worldview rested on the inconceivability of tragedy, it could not occur to them that their blindness was fated. Of course, anytime he says fate, he's talking about character's fate, right? He's talking about their character. That is incurable, unfree, all-dominating, and ultimately self-asphyxiating. With absolute certainty, they were convinced that God meant them for all time to be the absolute perfect standard of perfect and fulfilled humanity. So this is obviously a critique of moderns and the pursuit of happiness in a marketplace in which we think you can buy happiness, and advertisements that keep promising us, you know, how happy we're going to be, and how if you drink this beer, you'll get ladies, or buy this car and you'll get the ladies, or whatever. There's always, the commercials are always working on us on this level. This is sort of the level of conception that we're dealing with. And the more you work within that level, which is the level of douloi and benausoi, the more inconceivable an Aristos could be. It's inexpressible. Even what an Aristos could possibly want is inexpressible. And so the idea that some people might be fit to govern and other people might not be fit to govern is absurd. It's inexpressible. It's inconceivable. That can't be possible. They must be just like us. So they must be driven by their appetites and by their ideologies. And if they tell us that they should govern, it must be because they want to impose their appetites or ideologies on us. A modern interpretation of the opening of this sentence that Kenneth Smith is giving us is that it's impossible that it be true. He may be trying to diagnose for us what constitutes an Aristos, but we know we're not going to have the wool pulled over our eyes. We know that's not what he's doing. He's just propagandizing some kind of philosophy or ideology he's attached to. And the reason we know that is because we are so completely captured within the labyrinth of modern interpretations of the world that what he's trying to say is absolutely inexpressible. And that's where I'll wrap up for today. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can't help but share this sort of funny joke, and in the sense that modern technology is so appealing that somebody is choking and he can't breathe. So all the doctors gather along and they gave him this medicine, that medicine, and all sorts of things, by different theories. And somebody came along and said, why did you ask the guy who's choking him to not choke him anymore?
Like, somebody's doing it, but they couldn't imagine it. Yes, thank you. That's a good one, Phil. Stephen, go ahead.
Oops, sorry.
I was just wondering about the myth of Daedalus. You referred to it earlier. It was the myth of Telos, was it?
Yeah. Here we're talking about Daedalus.
Yeah, I know that. I was just trying. So it was actually the myth of Telos you were talking about earlier on.
Yeah, I alluded to him briefly, but I didn't really go into him. That'll take a little bit of time to do. But I'm glad you brought it up. We'll cover that next time. So, we just spent over 3 hours going through most of one sentence. And I think that after we get through this paragraph, the rest of it's going to come a lot faster, because this is where he's pulled together the first two sections, and this is what sets up the third section. But I hope that you can see, and that you see that this isn't me arbitrarily claiming that all this stuff is in there. This is the way he thinks and writes. He's thinking in terms of these frames of reference, and he wants to inject all of those works of meaning into the sentences that he writes so they can get more density there. But what it creates for us is a challenge.
Anyway, the myth of Gleitner will have to wait for another time.
Yes, it's in the second sentence that the Gleitner comes up. I thought we'd get through the whole paragraph, but I was mistaken. So I think we'll call that a wrap. And then David's scheduling us for July 5th, right? Tuesday of next week instead of Monday.